HPXLOTM, please call me Mr. Error by author Hoyne_Kyoma. Chapter 505-515. Loki ducked underneath a short jab from Chadwick as he smiled softly while continuing their banter as they walked towards the Missile Combat Crew Commander's MCCC's office. Are you being serious? Chadwick asked with surprise as he watched Loki dodge his punch effortlessly. Yeah, pretty much. We have a strict training regimen to enhance our reaction speeds. I should be the fastest among us. But Belmont probably isn't very behind. Really? Loki said, making a so-so gesture with his hands. And what about that other guy, Sergeant Ronald Weasley, if that's even his real name and designation? He's a newbie, but he's probably still better than you in a lot of things. Loki was about to speak more, but he paused as his eyes turned to look down from Chadwick to the other end of the corridor they were walking in. Someone's looking, Chadwick kindly mentioned as his grip on the rifle tightened. Nothing too drastic, but after hearing Loki's plan about being the bait in just the general situation of the launch facility currently, he couldn't leave himself unguarded. As such, even though talking to Loki seemed to have calmed him down before, the eerie darkness that had dimmed the corridor's end as it curved around a bend caused him to feel, slightly, nervous. Hey, you're up, Sarge, Loki said calmly, continuing walking as if whatever was about to step out of the darkness was just another person. Chadwick's eyes lingered on Loki's back for a second, noticing that Loki had noticed something too, the obvious signal that something was wrong about the situation. But Chadwick also noticed how nonchalant Loki was about it all and stepped forward himself as they continued walking down the corridor in silence. Their footsteps echoed in the mostly empty corridor, since everything this deep was now heavily guarded not by regular patrols but by the strictest of checkpoints. Even so, Chadwick could swear he could hear the sounds of heavy breathing sounding out from right behind the bend. His eyes narrowed, as his pupils shrank with each step towards the bend. Not because of fear, but because the sound of heavy breathing only grew harsher and harsher. The darkness visibly fluctuated, causing Chadwick to look at the lights for a second before snapping them back towards the bend as the heavy breathing grew deeper and deeper. His footsteps weighed carefully, each strike of the heel of his boots growing softer and lighter as they walked deeper, more measured and calculated as he prepared himself for any action. His eyes constantly flicked between the darkness in the bend and the lights while his mind started to sharpen its focus like the edge of a knife. And finally, when his pupils were reduced to the size of pinpricks, they stepped across with Loki leading the turn. Free, Chadwick raised his rifle shouting for the people on the other end to stop whatever they were doing and raise their hands up, but his words got caught in his throat. Came the voice of one of the confused guards standing silently while holding his own rifle, bewildered that their boss was holding them up. He nearly switched off the safety but managed to hold back at the last second when he recognized Chadwick. The other guard seemed equally confused too, but his focus was on Loki instead, his eyes sharp as he pushed away the surprise of being held up by his chief. While turning to Chadwick, he tightened his grip on his gun as he spoke up. Sarge. Chadwick's partially raised rifle dropped slowly as he looked at Loki with confusion. While Loki appeared completely oblivious to the entire situation and simply shrugged at him, as if to say, "Get on with it, will you? We need to move ahead." Chadwick suppressed the growing confusion of his own senses that had warned him quite severely just a few seconds prior as he spoke to officers he knew in passing. "We need to meet the commanding officer of the wing. Everything has already been cleared from up above." The officer raised his eyebrows, looking at his buddy before turning to look at Chadwick and then at Loki. "Can I see your ID and authorization orders?" Chadwick nodded, pulling out a bundle of papers from his kangaroo pouch as he handed them to his officers. Loki in the meantime caught his breath a little. Phew, it's getting a little hard to keep splitting worms and making so many marionettes. I almost wasn't able to turn them in time. But still, this seems like a waste, these guys are merely rose bishops. I can't keep separating worms just to control them. Can I do something better? Loki thought for a bit, and when an idea struck him, his eyes softened. Such a nice idea. Perhaps I should have done this all along. With their papers certified, Loki and Chadwick continued deeper into the launch facility with no one realizing that the facility was slowly being converted. The believers of one cult being stolen. And their mad god slowly turned madder. They passed each checkpoint with similar efficiency. Loki continued to enact his newly modified plan while Chadwick kept having his nerves played with. Each time they neared a strategic checkpoint he always felt tense. And although none of the newer checkpoints had visibly twitching shadows he could still feel the same sense of danger tingle as he neared them before it vanished like a puff of smoke as soon as they finally reached the checkpoint. Hush. Hermione nearly shouted out loud and only managed to calm down in the end since Tonks grabbed her hand while looking at the other officers around them warily. They're clean. Belmont nodded looking at Tonks who gave him a questioning look. Firstly, I don't sense any of them having too much vitality, and secondly we were attacked by one earlier. Tonks' eyes widened as she looked at Belmont speaking about it all so casually in front of the Muggles. But he just shrugged and said something silly that didn't make sense to Tonks at all. We were exposed from our undercover mission so we had to explain a few things to them, like the fact that we're from the headquarters and are professional hypnotists who can read people and hypnotize them a little, to do our work. We have 30 more to take care of. Tonks' mouth hung loose immediately. Hermione stepped in at that point, having gotten over her initial surprise and trying to bottle up the one she'd just received. Firstly, about the attack. We were attacked too earlier, but you're telling me there are 30 more of those guys. How are you so calm? Secondly, where's Loki? Tonks standing beside Hermione nodded swiftly. Her expression clearly speaking, how are these guys so calm about this? Don't they understand the severity of the situation? It's 30 Beyonders. There aren't that many dark wizards in Nocturne Alley on a good day for the Aurors to raid. But Ron and Belmont were jaded. He hypnotized one of them and then went down. Ron said, pointing at the officers with his eyes and then pointing down with his finger before wanting to continue, but Hermione interrupted. Performing the Confundus charm on one of them might not be hard for Loki if he puts his mind to it. But 30 of them, at once, and if there are 30 of them, there is surely someone higher here. Right. How are you guys so relaxed about it? We need to go to him. Now. But Ron chuckled. He then looked at Belmont and they turned back to look at Tonks and Hermione as they spoke calmly and sequentially, completing each other's sentences as if they were long-lost brothers. He did it wandlessly and silently. And on what was at least a sequence 6 if not a sequence 5. But there's 30 of the NNM. Hermione's head tilted sideways in confusion by the end of her sentence as their words sank in. Her brain fried as she tried to comprehend what seemed like a fairy tale. Did Loki just confound Ron and Belmont? What did you say? Tonks asked again, her ear widening a little, just enough to make the Muggles doubt what they were seeing, but Belmont and Ron knew, so they said it again. He did it wandlessly, and silently. And on what was at least a sequence 6 if not a sequence 5. If Tonks could, her mouth would have fallen to the floor. Hermione similarly looked shocked and surprised. Everyone, including Ron and Belmont, were once again left evaluating their life's power scale. Were wizards always this strong? Or did Beyonders just get weaker all of a sudden? Is this the power of the mystery prior pathway? Tonks and Hermione looked at each other, seemingly having the exact same ideas as each other about Loki's mastery of his abilities, and fell silent. If he can confound a sequence 5, it probably won't be that hard to take on 30 sequence 7s. Right. Single quote. Maybe we can do it too. Hermione had another weird thought at this point in time. Was it coincidental that we fell into this trap? Did that man arrange for this to happen? Should I ask Mr. Error for help? But, wouldn't it count as a wish? But Loki, oh, I know. He seems to be a shy god that doesn't know how to talk to others right. So as long as I inform him, I'm sure he'll send Mr. World or another one of his angels to help us if we promise to proselytize for him. Huh, you're so intelligent, my own. Why are you smiling like that? Ron asked in a low mumble, his body shivering as if he'd just seen his previous snarky narcissistic self in someone else, like he'd been shown a mirror to the past. So, Tonks said, looking at the Muggle officers who were still looking at Tonks and Hermione with sensitive gazes since they hadn't produced any identifying papers, but since they were inside the base and had already passed the checkpoints and seemed to know Belmont and Ron, they decided that the two girls were all right, for now. Belmont quickly caught on to what Tonks was trying to get at and explained, Loki's plan for us is probably to evacuate everyone at the base just in case something goes wrong, and that's what we were going to do before you guys showed up. Tonks nodded and added on her own point of view, the facility is too large for you to handle it alone. Have you informed the base about this? The Ministry? Yes. The Order? No. Belmont shrugged, ignoring the pointed glare Tonks was giving him. But when it got too blatant he snapped pointedly, you know those guys don't like freaks like us. And the Ministry does. Madam Bones never discriminates. Belmont retorted, since he knew well enough just how biased the Ministry that faced the public was, but since he was an unspeakable and fell under the purview of Madam Bones, he spoke boldly about his highest boss whom he'd never even seen, forget meeting. It was purely workplace pride, or in Belmont's case, pride of the only other place he could call home. Oh come on, Belle. You know just as well that those blood purists. Tonks. Hermione interrupted, squeezing her arm as Tonks' hair started to dye a crimson red. The sudden interruption in Hermione's painful squeeze let Tonks catch her nerves before Hermione's new words shot them tingling once again. Use occlumency. Hermione whispered urgently. Seriously, Hermione? You're telling us to do that? How could a spectator be manipulated so easily? Ron spoke even before Tonks could reply. Belmont was next. I see. So you were hiding your true colors all along then. Pretending to be a goody two-shoes in front of Madam Bones to advance your pathway, but ratting her movements out to the Order behind the scenes. Belmont was about to pull out his wand when Ron spoke with even more anger. You're right, Belmont. We can't let them think we're dogs. Let's just leave. No need to save these filthy mudbloods. He was about to drag Belmont with him before suddenly, the officers all around them pulled out their rifles and took aim. Where do you think you're going? You've been talking all this nonsense about wands, sequences and hypnotism all this time. Do you think we're idiots? I don't know what you did to get Sergeant Chadwick to believe you, but you can't be serious if you ever thought that we'd believe you. Several clicks resounded throughout the corridor as safeties flicked to hot. Hold oh, Tonks was about to try and calm everyone down, but Hermione acted faster. Her wand flicked as the officers and Ron and Belmont all turned into dazed and confused zombie-like manifestations as she quickly turned to Tonks. Hermione. Tonks. Listen, Hermione said, interrupting Tonks, squeezing her arms harder as the woman's composure was visibly shattering. Hermione hadn't realized yet, but Tonks' instincts were ringing. Wildly. A lot more wildly than when she'd fought off those Death Eaters that had attacked several Muggle areas at the end of last year, guided by the Divination Department's warning about not stopping such widespread activities which would only lead to a much larger failure. She still remembered looking at Madame Laura back then, how her instincts warned her back then that something big involving Madame Laura herself was about to happen. Something sharp and something dangerous. But right now her instincts felt like they weren't just warning her. It felt like they were serenading her death. A fact so certain that she felt like she'd found herself in front of the veil in the Department of Mysteries and was about to walk through it. Single quote. But Hermione continued speaking. Someone is causing everyone in the area to act strangely. I don't know who or how. Tonks nodded mindlessly, the light of her eyes already dimming as she struggled to keep her emotions calm even after using occlumency to clear her mind. But, Hermione said, and then paused. It was a pretty long pause, or at least it felt so, since Tonks' head started to ring again. She suddenly felt like she'd found hope. As if Hermione was a drop of cool water on a hot summer day that could quench her blistering thirst. And so the light in her eyes fired back up. Yes, what was I doing? Giving up? No, I can't do that yet. How did things even come to that? Tonks' head spun with a million questions and a million more answers, each worse than the last, since it meant that whatever was happening wasn't just affecting their minds and couldn't be blocked out by simply using occlumency. This was a high-sequence Beyonder ability. It's an item, right? Probably a high-sequence item. Definitely an item. It has to be an item. Even while Tonks was internally despairing, another part of her mind made her pay strict attention to Hermione speaking quietly. I have a way. Hermione finally revealed and then continued, but I need you to believe in me. Huh, why are you asking me for permission? Let's inform everyone we have to inform first. So that we can immediately request backup. This situation seems like it's getting out of hand quickly. Tonks nodded, not understanding why Hermione needed her trust. But Hermione stayed firm, her hands still clenching Tonks' arms with great strength as she spoke next. The spell on these guys will break down in another half a minute or so. I need you to keep them away from me. All right. Tonks nodded. Hermione stared deeply into Tonks' firm eyes and finally put aside her doubts about what she was about to do next. She too had already realized that simply using occlumency wasn't cutting it since for some strange reason, her ability to control her emotions was slipping. She'd feel angry at Ron for failing to control himself 1 second before she'd quickly feel disgusted about him even looking at her with his unintelligent brain the very next. And so once she had even the remotest sense of confirmation from Tonks, Hermione quickly knelt down while leaving Tonks to guard her back since things were quickly spiraling out of control. Tonks turned around almost immediately, not caring what Hermione was doing. It seemed like she was pulling out an altar, probably to summon a messenger and communicate with someone. Whoever it was, hopefully it'd be a high-sequence Beander, strong enough to save them. Did Miss Laura get Belmont's message? Will she arrive here herself? Perhaps Madame Bones will be here too. A surge of happiness entered Tonks' spirit for a moment as she thought of Amelia Bones, but then the imbalance in her emotions only grew stronger, like riding a tall wave only to fly off its crest into the depths of the raging waters. No way, this can't be important enough for Madame Bones to show up herself. Hopefully it isn't important enough for Madame Bones to show up herself. But I should ask Hermione to teach me this spell later. Quite useful. I don't think even the Confundus charm's so strong, being able to send so many Muggles and Beyonders in a daze. Especially Belmont too, since he's a sequence 7 and he's still in a daze. It'd be quite fatal in a heated battle since even a momentary lapse would allow me to suppress them with my brand of restraint. Oh, Ron seems to be breaking out of it first. Too bad I can't tease him about it again, but if I trap him in an arm lock, that'll have him blushing like an idiot, won't? I pray for the power of fate. I pray for the power of errors. I pray for God's loving grace. I pray for God's great powers to help his devout follower in this trouble, for she promises to spread word of his miracles all around. Beetle grass juice, a herb that belongs to the domain of error, I pray for you to bestow powers to my incantation. Twilight dew, a fragrance that belongs to the limbo of time, I pray for you to bestow powers to my incantation. Tonks froze, her eyes widening while she turned around slowly to look at Hermione. The words registered fully only a few seconds later. The single quote ... single quote. That's not a spirit messenger summoning ritual. Suddenly the word, trust, resounded in Tonks' mind. But that's an evil god. Tonks argued with herself, her hands trembling, her limbs turning cold, as her spine shivered with a stinging chill. It was an evil god on whom a bounty in the ministry existed for messing with the minister's office. Except Tonks couldn't lie to herself to panic. Since even after her conscious mind had registered what Hermione had just done, her instincts telling her that this was the only way out hadn't dimmed in the slightest. She could still feel it. Hermione was her only option in this ever-growing list of problems. And so before anything else happened, Tonks' wand flicked out as she cast a spell without even looking at the target. She trusted her instincts fully. And so when her instincts warned her that Belmont was about to mount an attack against her, she flicked her wand and shouted, Impedimentia. Loki paused, only momentarily, as he reached another checkpoint with Chadwick. This was the 5th one. Their next stop would be the MCCC's office. He had passed by about 15 Beyonders during this time. 2 at each checkpoint, plus people hiding inside shadows and some more in the stomachs of the Minute clerical staff. Everything seemed normal. For now at least. Or rather, until Loki suddenly heard the murmurings of prayers mid-stride. Who's praying right now? Loki thought, slightly annoyed. I should still check it out at least, maybe it has some more information. Using the Mentor of Deceit Beander characteristics and the several worms of time left behind in the Saphira Castle right now, Loki quickly listened to the prayers. Hermione. Why's she praying to me right now? Wasn't she supposed to be with Tonks? Did something? Loki's mind nearly froze when he saw Hermione. Her spirit body was wrought with corruption. The only reason his mind hadn't come to a total stop was because the corruption wasn't from an outer god. Or even any other god for that matter. It seemed more like a curse if all things were measured properly. So they did send in a saint. Or is it an angel? A sequence 2 who can deal with such strong corruption. And he's coming in from the top. So the plan that the lower level members knew was wrong. So they did plan this, taking my abilities into account. Was it Grindelwald who came up with the plan, Dumbledore who arranged it with a coincidence, or just the Aurora Order planning with Voldemort's knowledge about me? Each person knew different things about his capabilities or could affect him differently, so he'd need to respond differently in each case. Single quote. Single quote. Loki paused in the real world, causing Chadwick to stop beside him and look at him with confusion. His hand tightening around his rifle, his finger on the safety as his taut muscles tensed fully. But Loki's words, "Where's the closest washroom?" slapped all the air out of him. Chadwick almost choked, but Loki looked so serious that he didn't know how to go against him. So he ended up escorting Loki to the nearest toilet that the officers on the lowest level of the launch facility used. "Be quick, will you?" Chadwick said softly as Loki smiled and locked the stall behind him. Within seconds Loki was in the Saphira castle, where he crafted an illusory response immediately and sent it to Hermione. The little witch found her gaze filled with the gray fog before it panned over to show Mr. Error leaning calmly on his table as he spoke in a completely even tone. "I'm aware. Help is on the way." Hermione calmed down almost immediately, not just because she felt reassured but also because Loki had just stolen all her corruption, including the corruption in Ron, Belmont and Tonks. Along with all that, he'd also blessed her with a worm of time, secretly of course, so she wouldn't think that Mr. Error was a gross worm. Although, won't she end up becoming a worm too? Huh. I'd like to see her face then. Once Hermione's vision cleared, Loki conjured up another illusion which he sent to Snape and Dominic. Both of them had similar messages. The students of Hogwarts were in grave danger and were going to be involved in a battleground between angels at the launch facility they'd been sent to. Finally, Loki crafted another illusion, this time sending it to Fleur instead. Her message, however, was a little different. It was from Mr. World. "Miss Empress, I know of a few of your connections. I implore you to contact them and tell them that the Lord has a piece of information that would interest them. A student they care deeply about is in danger of being killed by an angel." Eventually, Loki sent a message to Walburga, who he had previously touched through the gray fog when she'd prayed to him to temporarily advance to Sequence 3. "Mr. World sends his regards. He has an instruction for you. When he gives the word, he wants you to kill." Walburga kept her eyes on the thick register in her hands as she studied the information about various hooligans that had been taking the spotlight in recent times when she'd gone away. "It's mostly them," Walburga whispered, pausing for a moment to take a sip of tea from her ornate cup made from the bones of some magical creature. Except she frowned softly while giving the cup a strange look when it touched her lips and placed it aside before leaning back on the chair to rest her burdened back as she closed her eyes and relaxed. "The brat promised me that he'd let me meet that suspiciously intelligent and all-knowing Gairman Sparrow for us to discuss a cooperation to take him down. But it's been a few months already, and not a word yet." Single quote. Single quote. Had it not been for Loki already being the blessed of a true god, evil or not, Walburga would have thrashed him for delaying things so much. But she too knew that it was unwise to rush matters regarding angels and other high-level mysticism occurrences if one didn't want the entire situation to explode in their faces. As such, Walburga had been waiting patiently, even if the wait was slowly turning particularly tortuous. After all, those of the sleepless pathway didn't need to sleep a whole lot. And so she had the dead silence of the night to let her thoughts wander. With her eyes closed, Walburga thought about the news she'd received from Bones earlier in the day, about the kids from Hogwarts being sent to dangerous missions. She was worried for a second, wishing for Loki's safety, but quickly caught herself. Good for him if he gets into trouble. He kept ruining my sleep schedule with all those midnight letters of his. Although, given the marriage proposal between him and Bones, I wonder if he's found someone. He better not have scared her off with his terrible dressing sense. Just thinking about Loki's clothes and general style from the first few months she spent with him made Walburga shudder. She was about to pick up the perpetually cold teacup she'd set aside earlier when her hand froze. A thick gray fog descended in her vision as a message played out. "Mr. World sends his regards. He has an instruction for you. When he gives the word, he wants you to kill as many members of the Aurora Order as you can." Walburga's first reaction was surprise as she heard Loki's voice out of nowhere, watching him kneel in front of an altar and speak directly to her, followed by a deep sense of focus and urgency as she processed what Loki was telling her to do. This brat. Walburga nearly cursed up a storm, only managing to hold herself back as she realized she was still surrounded by a sea of gray fog. What does he think the Black family is? Are we hitmen for hire? We're supposed to be the ones doing the hiring. But feeling a gaze wash over her, Walburga quickly stood up from her chair once the vision vanished as she knelt and paid her respects to the evil god she'd come in contact with before. However, even after she finished her prayers, Walburga remained kneeling. Kill as many members of the Aurora Order at once. What good would that do? While I'd already planned on doing so to re-establish the Black family's dominance to secure some funding for the war to come, isn't this a bit too hasty? What would killing off a bunch of lunatics have to do with the supposed intelligent and crazy follower? Whatever it is, I'll make sure that the Black family earns the lion's share of the pie. And I need to make sure Loki learns his lesson once he's back. He keeps using the Black family resources like he's at a gambling den. Well, at least unlike Sirius, he wins in the end. With that, Walburga stood up, downed the chili tea in one go before clearing her throat, setting herself upon her chair like a ruler as she spoke. Creature. There was a sharp crack in the air as Creature apparated to her side, bowing in subservience as he kept his large dropping ears open. Spread the word in the slums. Masquerade all the crimes the Aurora Order has carried out in my absence. Focus especially on how they've fought like cowards to steal only from the weak by turning them on each other. Yes, lady. Creature can do so. Anything else? Creature whispered in his hoarse tone as his large pointed nose touched the floor, flopping like a dead fish. Yes. Make sure to send a message to the Order. If they're to interfere in what's coming next, the Black family will pull their support from Britain. Especially from Gringotts. Quote. Creature shuddered as he heard Walburga's icy tone that suggested something far deeper than she was letting on, but it wasn't his place to ask, and so he stood by until he was dismissed by a wave of his lady's hand. Nick. Prunell rushed over, caring not for the several little mechanical servants she trampled on as she arrived by Nicholas's side. What happened? Nicholas asked with a face full of seriousness, his eyes not even lingering on the rather precious rare-to-obtain materials that were so easily destroyed. It's Loki. Huh, Nicholas said as he felt a thin sting in his chest. It was a feeling he'd only felt as he watched his particularly close friends leave one by one as they grew older and failed to advance, sometimes dying by his own hands. No way, I know that brat. Nothing could have happened to him. You saw him during the World Cup. Prunell matched Nicholas's gaze and bit her lips with a tinge of worry. It hasn't happened yet, but it seems like an angel is targeting him. Angel? Who? Which pathway? It can't have been Dumbledore. I've talked to him, he's downright terrified of messing with anyone under her protection. I don't know, but that's what Fleur's letter says. She sent it urgently after someone from his organization told her that an angel is interested in killing a student we know. Quote. Nicholas paused, his gaze turning cold and sharp as he thought through things, his sharp analytical mind a gift of the savant pathway combined with the prowess of an angel giving him the only other possible explanation. The Aurora Order. Yes, I thought so too, but they couldn't have gotten a Sequence 1, they have a true god, even if he's maddened and evil, and no one above Sequence 5 because they're evil. Prunell rejected the question, or rather only affirmed Nicholas's true thoughts. It can't be Dumbledore. Nicholas paused, his thoughts slowly rolling off his tongue as if he were in disbelief. So it's someone else from history. The meaning of his question clear, if it wasn't someone from an established pathway, how did they survive for so long without help from the true god of their pathway? Was it another hidden god like the one who had met him? But that couldn't be possible, could it? To hide a god was not easy. Especially not without the help of the darkness pathway. So the only other way would be that they kept themselves hidden. But what god could hide themselves from other gods so easily, vanishing from history, even if they could hide themselves from commoners like him and Prunell? The entire scenario seemed like an enigma. A soft shadow extended from the base of a man's feet. It felt like there was a depression beneath him. He walked calmly, his footsteps echoing the rowdy corridors, bringing a sense of rhythm to the chaos, amplifying it with each step, making people eat their own fingers, rip apart their faces with their bare hands, vomit blood in each other's mouths, the usual. He'd seen his own followers do a lot more bizarre things, so he wasn't fazed in the slightest. Hell, he'd done much worse things himself. All for the Lord. Lord, accept our sacrifices. No, mine, my sacrifice. Please Lord, you must take me. Voices rang in his head as usual, filling his otherwise silent outwardly appearance with a chattering background. His eyes pierced through the obstacles in his way, locking straight onto the target he'd been assigned to by his Lord. Ha ha ha, his head will serve as our Lord's conduit to spread across the universe. Blasphemy. Our Lord doesn't need such a silly gift. This is but an appetizer to prepare the world for his unshakable presence. The man kept his gaze locked onto the flowing disturbances caused by the boy's aura in the spirit world. His eyes, listening, to the boy's every move, every ability, every secret and every mystery. The boy looked like a normal Sequence 7 Beyander of the Mystery Prior pathway. To an extent that one of him was confident that if he were to graze the boy, the most he would get in return would be a mere Sequence 7. Is it truly as that man proclaimed? Blasphemy. How dare you question the Lord's orders? He must be exorcised, baptized by the Lord's loving grace. The man continued walking, his gaze steady, fixed solely on the boy's location as he traveled deeper and deeper into the depths of the dense structure they were playing in. In a way, the situation seemed poetic. The boy was digging a grave for himself. Going deeper and deeper, sinking into the darkness as he brought about a cover from above to fully bury the boy alive and watch as life slowly left the boy's eyes while squirming in his grasp. As the three-faced saint walked deeper into the corridors, he never realized a man walking right behind him, Gellert Grindelwald. Looking disinterestedly at the show that was being put on around him, Grindelwald occasionally paused to pull out a small doll from thin air. He'd look at the doll, frown slightly and then toss it back into the void it had originated from. They walked together, slowly, as if reveling in their own thoughts, neither acknowledging the other, one out of power, the other out of inability. Soon they entered the first elevator where Grindelwald pulled out another figure from the void. The figure was of a long-bearded old man with a hooked nose that looked like it had been broken at least twice, wearing a long purple glitter-studded gown. The projection's eyes were unfocused for a moment before they regained a stark and a clear sense of clarity and focus. Gellert, you called. Grindelwald nodded, his face all smiles and a harmless sense of measure as he spoke quirkily. Have you written it yet? It doesn't seem to be working. I have, Dumbledore said, stroking his beard, looking more interested in the saint in front of him who was burdened by a stark brand of madness but still in control. But he soon lost interest and turned to judging the shininess of his beard as Grindelwald spoke again. She's interfering again. Not quite. Dumbledore shook his head. You've kept her busy, I'm sure of that. It's them I'm truly worried about. I can't write any more since their influence is at its peak. Any more and I believe I'll be losing my only opportunity, so pardon me, my old friend. Truly. A friend. After all we've done together. Dumbledore looked at Grindelwald and gave him a quirky smile, his eyes twinkling, almost as bright as his purple gown as he spoke softly. Now Gellert. You can't go reminding me about such things now. I've got front seats to an apotheosis ritual to take part in. Forgive me for now, but I promise to guide you into the new era at the most opportune moment. Hey, Grindelwald chuckled and shook his head. Don't worry, forgiveness isn't something that you need to keep tabs on with me. I will make sure to keep your seat warm. Loki looked straight up through the ceiling, spotting the reason for his weird feeling and then looking back down. Just a saint. Why are they so sure that I'll die? Loki's fists clenched in anger. Loki could clearly see the blood and bits of flesh dripping off the saint of the hanged man pathway above him. The bits and pieces floated into the air, mixing with it in the form of a bloody mist as it corrupted and set everyone inside it in a spiraling sense of despair. Loki tried his best to remain unaffected by the madness and remain calm, but seeing so many innocent people be so ruthlessly tortured didn't fit in. It was like taking a salted lemon to a fresh wound. Things were bound to get painful. But Loki didn't let his guard down. No. Instead he doubled down on his plan. Loki turned his head away and continued working, playing along with the trap he'd set up. He was just the bait, a mere worm, dangling helplessly on a hook, swaying left and right in the gentle breeze as the warm rays of the sun slowly cooked it to perfection. Although the strange appearance of the Saint of the Aurora Order pathway from the top of the base had thrown off his tempo a little, he stayed silent. Fighting against an angel wasn't something one could do on a whim. After all, the only fighter truly strong is the one that survives in the end. I hope Nicholas and Pernell act soon, if not this is going to become a big mess. Hermione stood up slowly. As soon as the ritual had ended she'd felt a heavy burden on her spirit. Her head throbbing lightly as she felt waves of foreign spirituality clash with her spirit body as it was inexplicably removed before it could harm her. And after a few seconds, that excess burden stopped, as if whatever Mr. Error had done had taken care of all her problems. But a bitter taste still lingered in Hermione's mouth. Help is on the way. So I was right. Something dangerous is going to happen. Hermione frowned. Just then Tonks grabbed Hermione's hand tightly. But Hermione found no fear in her gaze, instead Tonks seemed rather eager. But before either of them could speak, Ron interrupted them. Arg, bloody hell, who took a broom to my head? I feel like someone just dunked me with a jar of purely aged lovage. Hermione rolled her eyes and turned to look at Belmont, who looked bewildered himself. What just happened? Hermione paused for a moment and was about to explain truthfully, knowing that with Tonks having seen everything she couldn't just hide it without permanently obliterating some of her memories, but Tonks beat her to it. She used a spell to steal away the charm affecting you. Tonks said, giving Hermione a wink causing her to breathe a sigh of relief. Ron noticed this, but said nothing. He didn't want to have another spell rearrange his face. Either way, he knew from his memories that the last bit of time was all fudged up, and so he chalked it up to a coincidence. But why do I still feel so terrible? It feels like something is hammering away at my head. Ron mumbled, causing everyone else to frown too. And before they could even begin to inspect themselves to see why they weren't, the officers beside them all suddenly started to collapse to the floor. The sudden action caused Hermione's heart to drop. She pulled out her wand to try and stop whatever was happening, but the force that had just receded earlier returned with full force, sending her spiraling to the floor. The world blurred as her legs started to feel wobbly, like jello. Tonks beside her fared even worse than everyone else. Her instincts ringing alarm bells as a raging thump echoed in her chest. It almost felt like her heart was about to explode. Hermione managed to force her eyes open, fighting as an unending sense of despair began to blaze in her chest like a bright star. That was when she saw it. And it sent a violent fit of revulsion through her. The officers were all on the floor, some crawling over each other, trying to strip the other of clothes by using their teeth, chewing through the Kevlar, ripping their gums in the process, snapping their teeth, others simply biting their nails off and forcing it into their eyes, and a few that had managed to scoop their eyes out with their hands and were in the process of chewing it. It all happened without any opposition. In fact, the officers were all smiling. Their bleeding mouths painted an eerie picture as their eyes gazed tenderly at the blood pooling around them. It looked like they were in love. Suddenly Tonks pulled out a straw doll from her pocket and tossed it into the open air. Hermione recognized the doll instantly. Its straw patterns were the same. And if she couldn't recognize that, she could easily see their eager march towards death. They were the straw dolls that were tied up in the Department of Mysteries that always tried to kill themselves. Run! Tonks shouted, pushing Hermione in the opposite direction to wherever the straw doll tumbled towards. Hoping to keep at least her alive. But Hermione held on. She didn't leave. She'd left people to die because of her inability once. And now that she could save someone else, she'd rather do everything she could. Her mind debated only for a second before she rushed to pull the fallen and confused Belmont and Ron towards herself. She then placed her hand in the open air and pushed out her spirituality. An enchanting spiritual door formed almost instantly, leaving Tonks bewildered as Hermione pushed the door open. However, as soon as she did, Hermione froze. Not just because the door had instantly taken on a reddish-crimson hue, filled with blood and whispering deathly mumbles that caused her mind to slowly descend into madness. But because at the other end of the door were people she did not recognize. Are we going to die? Hermione thought to herself, feeling a sense of deep oppression from the people in front of her. They looked down at her equally bewildered, but then surprisingly smiled. Why are they smiling? I told you it'd work, Nick. You're still just as reckless as ever, Pernell. You really broke into a random person's teleportation spell. Whatever it is, this young witch might have just saved them all. The bickering couple walked through the door Hermione had kindly still held open as they looked at the unsightly officers on the floor without even batting an eye. That was when Hermione's mind clicked. Nick. Prunell. Nicholas Flamel. Hermione nearly screamed, causing Nicholas to actually turn around and wink at her, as if he was reading her mind. However, he turned around and became serious the next. Get ready to take them somewhere safe, Prunell. You don't need to tell me more. Prunell whispered as she began to flick her wand, causing a large amount of runes to erupt from its end. Hermione recognized some of them, but that sum was not even a drop in the ocean when compared to the amount pouring out. It was pretty clear that Prunell was doing something strange, if not outright crazy. After all, no spell needed such a large amount of runes for anything. What does she want to teleport? The entire launch facility. Hermione scoffed in her mind, causing Prunell to give her a soft giggle with a wink before she focused on her work again. No way, Tonks mumbled, having only just figured out the identities of the two legends before her. Are they? She asked, looking at Hermione, who nodded unsurely. Her mind already racing, thinking if this is what Mr. Error meant by help being on the way. The tension that had stressed her out before started to lessen slowly as she fell into a soft lull of comfort because whatever Prunell was doing seemed to induce a sense of calm and effortless warmth in the surroundings. Let's get out of here. Tonks whispered to Hermione as the latter quickly pulled a new door into existence. However, before the door could fully form, it shattered. Hermione's eyes widened in surprise, not being able to comprehend what had just happened as she searched the area for the cause and found Nicholas pointing his wand at her. Don't do that, he said, slightly annoyed. You were lucky earlier that it was just us who arrived here through that. Hermione's eyes widened further. How could I be so stupid? This is clearly a battle between high sequence beyonders. I might have let our enemies know our location and reach us so easily if they had the ability to move like me. Hermione wanted to apologize, but she didn't have the time or the energy since the shadows around them all suddenly exploded, not into corrupting murmurs or even spikes like the shadow ascetic from before, but into a searing gaze that looked like it could pierce through their souls. Tonks clenched Hermione's hand tighter while Ron broke out into hives as Belmont bared his fangs in a hiss. The shadows felt like they were staring at them, studying them, understanding them in maddening detail as if they were mere prey on dishes, waiting to be eaten by a hungry beast slurping its drippings. Nicholas noticed and almost immediately flicked his hand, and for a second Hermione felt something terrifying brush against her core. For a moment she felt like her soul had been touched, but she didn't have the capability to feel it yet, and hence she couldn't discern if that was what had happened. But the brush faded as soon as it arrived, skipping her entirely. Its effect, however, was plain to see for everyone. Almost immediately distorted creatures crawled out of the shadows, falling in hordes, flailing around as they screeched in pain and horror as a wealthy mass of mist floated out of their bodies and towards Nicholas. It all happened in the span of a few seconds. The beings that had just felt like an insurmountable threat to the low-level Beyonders present were solved just like that, with a flick of Nicholas's wrist as he used the enhanced ability of an arcane scholar, life extraction. And while Hermione felt a little carefree as she realized that Nicholas Flamel was someone truly powerful, she couldn't help but feel fear again when she saw shock and surprise in Nicholas's face as he mumbled. How? No way. How is this possible? Nicholas looked at Prunell and saw her similarly shocked. Their eyes soon locked, Prunell's lips trembling along with her eyes as she looked at Nicholas for advice. But he seemed equally shocked. His mouth only opened and closed lightly before he asked softly, "They can't be used as sacrifices." Prunell shook her head, her eyes reddening rapidly in annoyance and anger as she said, "They can't. I don't know what it is about, but he detected that we were going to involve her, and managed to fight back against her intrusion. But he's mad," Nicholas shouted, causing Prunell to laugh with pity and self-confusion. She couldn't understand what had just happened too. Like Hermione had predicted earlier, she did want to move the entire launch facility somewhere else. But not just to keep them safe. No, Prunell's plans were much bigger. Deserving of an angel of the White Tower pathway. As a wisdom angel, she had foreseen the possibility of the true creator interfering directly in this battle by sending a flood of shadow creatures. It was why she was able to plan ahead. planned to break into the launch facility, which was surrounded from all sides both in the spirit world and the real world by Death Eaters or an outer god's supporters, which included corrupted spirits and beyonders of various pathways like the chained pathway. Her wisdom told her that there would definitely be a moment that she could exploit to enter the facility. It was triggered by the fact that Loki, in spite of being trapped inside, had been able to send a message for help. Or rather, someone was able to observe his situation and send them to help him. So there was hope to break in. That only left breaking out. No matter what method they used to break into such a heavily guarded place unnoticed, getting out was going to be much harder. Firstly, because their means of entry could be blocked and obstructed, so they couldn't use it to exit, and secondly because whatever they did inside the launch facility would put the full focus of all the Beyonders in the area on them. And so she'd planned further ahead by making an exit plan. And in doing so, she settled on the most basic but reliable plan. Hit your enemy where it hurt the most and then dip the moment you had your chance. What? It would rile up your enemy. Oh please, she'd riled up an outer god and lived to tell the tale. Although it had left her a little shaken, this wasn't an outer god. Only a few measly shadow creatures and possibly an angel. Nothing to sweat about. And what better weapon to use than the one provided to you for free? Specifically, Purnell wanted to make the launch facility the carrier of the ICBM and then watch as it detonated in their enemy's face, giving them her personally frosted gift of purification before dipping away with everyone else she could save. How would they survive a nuclear explosion? Nicholas would take care of that. His ability to manipulate physics wasn't for show after all. But it seemed like none of it would ever see the light of day, since their enemy had suddenly included the true creator, himself. A few minutes earlier, Loki felt something touch his soul. He reacted near instantly to push out whatever was feeling him up until he felt it wash over without harm. In the same instant he felt the inherent value of the entire place around him rise. It almost made him feel like stealing the entire place and pocketing it before vanishing to leave the aftermath for the Muggles and the Ministry to handle. And so Loki activated his spirit vision to examine what had happened. Nick, Loki thought. He activated his spirit vision once again and noticed something rather peculiar. Single quote ... question mark single quote. Firstly, he noticed the mass of shadowy creatures who strangely had vague forms in his spirit vision on the upper floors, all moving rapidly towards the top. But more importantly and more glaringly, he noticed runes floating all around him. Not just him. Every wall, every brick, every pipe, every wire. All of it was slowly being coated with a dense layer of runes. Loki quickly studied the ones near him as his brows raised. Too many holes. This is probably Purnell's old archived work. They're trying to take this entire launch facility somewhere else. But where? How would that even help? Since they seem to be taking everyone inside it along with them too. A prepared battleground. Loki calmly broke into Purnell's densely intertwined system of runes, spotting errors effortlessly without even using his mentor of deceit characteristics. Where? There are no relative coordinates. So it isn't anywhere on the planet. Random point in the cosmos. No, that would be way too risky. The astral realm. Where in the astral realm? Surely neither Purnell nor Nicholas have a divine kingdom to lean on. Did they have help from the gods of their pathways? The White Tower and the Paragon. So either Helga if she has accommodated the White Tower pathway, or Rowena if she has accommodated the uniqueness of the Paragon pathway. But would either of them have the time to do anything regarding that? Aren't they busy? With Mother Tree of Desire interfering with the rest of the world currently. Trying to strengthen the barrier using their divine kingdoms. Loki frowned. Going to the astral realm physically wasn't a simple trip that one could take as a joke. The spirit world itself was easy to get lost in without the right anchors for Beyonders, not of the door pathway, but the astral realm where the divine kingdom of gods resided. Going there was like suicide. Simply glancing at the wrong thing could kill you because you must not look at a god. Let alone the manifestation of their pathway and will. Only someone crazy would go there. But even if you had the permission to take refuge in a god's divine kingdom, why would a well-thinking person go to the closest point between the Earth and the cosmos when outer gods are currently attacking the planet? Loki's eyes scanned for more of the runes, trying to figure out what Purnell actually wanted to do until he suddenly spotted a rather strange rune pattern floating about. The pattern itself wasn't small, which was why it had taken him so long to find. It was formed out of the runes spread all over the launch facility, with several tiny runes connecting with each other to form the larger sun. Yes, a sun. Purnell had painstakingly painted the entire launch facility into the symbol of the sun. So we're going to Helga's domain after all. But Loki abandoned that thought without hesitation. They wouldn't just get a little tan if they did that. He doubted even their bones would be left if they did that. Then what were they going to do? Loki studied the runes a little and found himself coming to a block. There's no direct location here. So is it not the astral realm after all? Only the runes for the sacrifice. Wait, sacrifice. That soul-sucking thing earlier then. The shadow creatures. Loki's all-round vision focused back up to look at the shadowy creatures that were writhing around, flailing as they tried to fight whatever was pulling away their souls. It caused Loki to instantly frown. Nicholas failed to steal their lives. The lives of puny shadow creatures. How? Or, did he stop stealing their lives once they got out of the shadow realm? But Loki paused that thought for now as his earlier questions were answered. The shadow realm. To the true creator. She wanted to let the sun goddess show a manifestation of her will in the shadow realm. Single quote. Loki shuddered and thought with a soft smile, and she told me not to do reckless things. However, the smile vanished just as quickly as it arrived. But Nicholas failed to use their sacrifices as an anchor to break into the shadow realm and allow for the destination part of Purnell's spell to be complete. Instead of dying in the shadow realm, those creatures were instantly pushed outside. As if whatever had sent them detected Purnell's ideas immediately and acted without hesitation. So Mr. Rap God, Loki thought with a short puzzled expression. If only antiviruses worked so fast they could have made a magic system of their own without the need for my perfection. But I guess there can only be one Mr. Perfect error. While it wasn't unimaginable that a god was in charge of everything in their domain and could immediately expel bad actors within it, it was a little hard to imagine that he could act so fast while he was mad because he only has a pity-filled handful of believers who can't even help maintain his sanity. There's something else going on here, right? No way the true creator of this world is actually the inheritor of the will of God Almighty and has been hiding behind the facade of madness all this time. No, that can't be the case. Helga would have noticed it much earlier. And isn't there no God in the visionary pathway? So how could the true creator be such a good actor? Loki's frown, however, only deepened. But he pushed aside the question for now. Instead, Loki frowned as he thought of something rather unpalatable. If I'd actually been a mentor of deceit, I could have taken over and helped them by exploiting the shadow creature's inherent connection to their domain. But without doing that, it'd be hard to send a couple of people, forget an entire launch facility. It was a long time in the coming. But Loki felt the wall again. A wall that he could only cross by becoming stronger. By rising in sequence. And so, Loki ignored everything that was happening above him. He knew what he was doing right now would help him digest his potion faster than anything else he'd done. And if he could somehow complete parasitizing the magic system, he'd have the perfect ritual to advance to Mentor of Deceit. Parasitizing the modern system of magic. Loki paused at the thought. He'd spent several months on this problem already. But they'd all led to the same dead ends. The only promising lead he had been pursuing had come to him only recently. Studying the patterns of connection to the Chaos Sea that Rowans had left behind in the Room of Requirements and the Hogwarts wards to figure out any of the errors she'd left behind in the entire system for him to exploit. But things were proving to be rather difficult. Everything seemed perfect. Not that there weren't loopholes to exploit. No. The runes all around the school and in the Room of Requirements were self-contained. Almost like the school was a living, breathing singular entity that could command those runes like they were parts of its body. And so to find a loophole that connected it to the Chaos Sea, Loki couldn't find any. Not because he couldn't see it, but because they didn't seem to exist at all. How could you find a fault with a living being, after all? Where would you even start? It wasn't like a living being had a mechanical mind where you could exploit their thoughts or a body which could be used to make them hit their head. And Hogwarts seemed like one like that. It seemed alive in every way other than having a normal body or a mind like a human being, almost as if the castle was but a character it controlled somehow while hiding inside itself. Of course, if it were so easy, Dumbledore would have probably figured it out as the headmaster of the school for so long. Given that even he hasn't figured anything out yet. Loki frowned. Is this really not the time for me to advance? Will I digest my potion fully and have to search for another chance? Loki's frown deepened. It left a shitty taste in his mouth. Chaos C. Hogwarts. Something wrong. Loki found his concentration broken as Chadwick tapped his shoulder. Loki asked, his eyebrows raised as he looked up to notice that they were going to arrive at the MCCC's office. Oh, nothing. Just thought of something strange. Well, Chadwick didn't look convinced since Loki was frowning pretty deeply. His guard was fully relaxed, busy in his own world as he walked while simply following him around. But he didn't pry too much. Instead, Chadwick spoke quickly, whatever it is, I hope it won't distract you anymore. Since we're at the MCCC's office, it's about time for the rest of them to show up. Loki nodded. The plan had been laid. All he had to do now was to wait for the prey to take the bait. And to do that he had a single idea. Funnel them to the king's throne and behead them ruthlessly. We'll try again later, Nicholas said, his gaze turning sharp again as he looked at the new arrival. Prunell nodded similarly. Everyone, Ron, Hermione, Belmont and even Tonks along with Prunell all eyed the newly arrived person with varying degrees of fear. Nicholas's gaze, like the others, was just on the strange calmly robed man, dressed like a Templar, in front of him. The low-sequence Beyonders, apart from the fact that their heads felt like they'd burst if they even looked a little bit longer in the Templar's direction, were also afraid because he radiated a natural aura of true madness. A maddening divinity which seemed to be barely contained within his body. Random twitches, soft cracks, and the wriggling underneath his smooth skin all put them on edge as they wondered with fear if the man would release everything contained within him soon and crush them with it. Prunell was worried since the very fact that a Beyander could repel the spell she'd prepared for the situation meant that he wasn't as simple as he seemed even if he did it with the help of a true god. She didn't know if that was a one-time thing or if the true creator could spread his influence further, and if so what he was waiting for, but the Templar didn't seem like a sequence 3 at all. At least definitely not a simple sequence 3. And given that she had to protect the children along with Loki who was buried underneath and was moving down faster put her on edge. Suddenly however Nicholas's eyes widened as he whipped his wand. Except the blinding spell that tore it out of it seemed to miss its target's head. He's getting old. No, it was the Lord's grace that did it. 3 voices in the Templar's head ran out at once as he struggled to figure out which one was his. Even Prunell and the other low-sequence Beyonders seemed surprised by Nicholas's spell shooting slightly away from the Templar's head. It shot past, naturally, however it didn't fly further into the corridor. Instead there was a soft flash of light as a random mirror appeared in between the corridor. The spell hit the mirror and instead of shattering it, rippled the surface of the mirror like a stone dropped into a still pond before sinking into its depths, vanishing just like the stone sinking. The low-sequence Beyonders were all still surprised since they didn't see much of anything apart from the mirror. Even the Templar seemed alarmed as he made way to the edge of the corridor where he backed himself up into a wall. A member of the Reader Pathway. Prunell whispered, unbelievable, how? Nicholas stowed away his wand. It was only a hunch earlier since he'd felt the shift in the movement of the molecules in the air around him. He'd almost ignored the shift too, considering it simply something being caused by the shadow creatures hidden in the Templar's shadow. But the very fact that he'd conveniently ignored it caused him to raise an alarm. Ignore a key fact in battle. When did he get so sure of himself? The only conclusion was that someone was manipulating his body of heart and mind through the sea of subconscious. And there was only one other person who could currently do it in the world. Albus Dumbledore. But would Dumbledore be so sloppy in his work? Would a Sequence 1 King of Angels be sloppy enough to get caught by a measly Sequence 2? And that was where Prunell's conclusion came in. Grindelwald, Nicholas mumbled. There was a moment of silence before claps rang out. Clap 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 clap. Quote ... Wonderful. The clapping only got faster as the voice turned joyful. CLAP 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 clap. How wonderful. We finally meet. At long last. I did bring you out of your hiding hole during the war on Paris, but never met you then. What a surprise meeting you today, Mr. Flammel. I've heard a great deal about you from our common friend. And then the clapping stopped. But how are you going to leave from this meeting alive, Mr. Flammel? You lived the last time because you didn't dare face me. This time, there's no Albus around, to warn you not to cross me. Zip it. Nicholas retorted, I only stayed out of it the last time because Albus wanted to take you down himself. Your presence here is definitely a surprise, but only for long enough for me to truly put your name into the annals of history. Since adding another ant to a battle of elephants doesn't make much difference. Grindelwald's face slowly appeared. His hair first, his body after, and finally his face, glowing inwards as they settled on his mismatched eyes before vanishing into them, revealing a deathly pale man looking at them with a deathly smile. How wonderful, then I wish to see if you can truly drag me into death. Grindelwald said and revealed his hand. It held a simple bone-white unremarkable wand other than its pointed tip, but Nicholas and Prunell instantly felt a thump of danger spread through their very souls. Of course, if you wish to take me to death, then let me just give you a taste of it first. Grindelwald's wand fell casually, its tip drawing a straight line in the air as a thin stream of mist slipped out of it. This is one of my favorite spells, Grindelwald said, his face breaking into an eerie smile as he completed the incantation, not out of necessity but out of the impulse to act as an artist. Speculum mundi. The ethereal mist spread into the air around them as Nicholas immediately reacted, knowing that whatever the spell was it could not be allowed to complete. A sudden tornado formed in the air, howling the winds as it bent unnaturally and fell directly upon Grindelwald like a wave on the sea. Except, Grindelwald's figure only distorted in response before it smiled while speaking, Am I here, or am I not? And before anyone could respond, the smile on his face vanished as did his body, leaving behind only a few words to echo as his entire being seemingly vanished into thin air. Too bad you have more important things on your hands, or your minds. No one was left waiting after that. The low sequence beyonders instantly collapsed, their eyes rolled back as they stared off into the depths of their hearts. Tonks said, getting up out of her bed slowly. Her head ached for a split second but she didn't mind it, chalking it up to having stayed up late last night to help out Professor Sprout sort the ingredients she'd helped collect in the greenhouse. What day is it today? Tonks asked herself, checking the timetable she'd copied and kept in her charms book since that was her favorite class. But a note slipped out of the book, causing her to bend down to pick it up. On it were the simple words. Constant vigilance. That was all she read before her room went, boom. Belmont looked up at the large manor standing on the mountain peak. Thunder roared around it as he stood nervously at the foot holding a letter. He glanced at the name on the letter and gulped. Will they accept Professor Snape's response? After all, we don't allow our kind to exist unless turned by one of us. Will they truly accept someone that's not a slave growing stronger than them? Ron sat in his bed puzzled and slightly pale. What are spiders doing in my bed? Hermione looked at Daphne's exploded body with disgust. Who made this nonsense? It isn't scary at all. It's clearly an illusion, and here I thought the greatest Dark Lord who terrorized Paris would be scary. Voldemort is much scarier, at least he doesn't rely on party tricks. Nicholas looked up at Prunell lying in bed in front of him, coughing up blood as thick branches grew around her hand. This is a dream, Nick, Prunell on the bed said softly, stroking Nicholas's face with her proper hand. I know. Then break it, Prunell said with a smile. Nicholas paused and looked around the room before looking back at Prunell on the bed. You've told me that about 300 times now, and I've broken the dream 100 more, and all I've ended up at is back right here. Prunell kept her eyes closed. Her mind was blank, and her heart was cold. She stood like a mechanical puppet. She knew exactly why she was like this. She was in the abyss. Or at least she was reliving her memories of it. But she was different from the rest, in that she didn't seem to have figured out that it was all a dream anyway, or was it? Standing outside the MCCC's office waiting for their papers to be processed and returned through the small hatch in the iron doors so that they could be given permission to enter inside, Loki looked calmly at the MCCC on the other side of the door, whose body had been converted into a simple host for what was a demigod. Loki thought softly. The shadows were dense and collected and he could distinctly feel a vague gaze upon him through them. The feeling was so evident that Loki could even feel the hint of divinity leaking out of them. Looks like the artifact that Grindelwald gave them all doesn't work that well on demigods. But then Loki paused. No, that can't be the case. I didn't find any other demigods on the way. So only this one's artifact was broken. Or this demigod in particular lost control or has less control over his artifact. Loki almost frowned but managed to keep his expressions in check as he continued thinking. Oh, is it because of the true creator's influence at the edge of the shadow world just recently to expel those shadow creatures that caused this guy to lose control slightly? Well, either way, that just makes my job easier. Having come all this way here by parasitizing and turning various Hanged Man Pathway members into marionettes, Loki had a decent grasp of their thinking. And as such, he could easily guess just what the demigods would do once they saw him. The first thing they'd do was listen. To try and gauge their opponent. To try and understand what made him better. To construct the perfect plan to make him expose his weaknesses and then smother him with the perfect counters crafted out of a varying combination of grazed souls of Beyonders. And so, even before they stepped into the most important office in the launch facility, Loki split off a bunch of worms of time from his mythical creature form and let them be teleported into the room after he stole their position and reassigned it with one of the badges on the MCCC's chest. It was an easy operation, one that went entirely unnoticed because Loki wrapped those worms of time in wisps of gray fog from the Saphira castle. And so the game began. The worms began to transmit mysticism knowledge regarding the true creator into the vicinity of the MCCC. Not just speak them out loud, but actually transmit the knowledge directly into the surroundings as compulsive thoughts, filled with the emotion of curiosity and the desire to know more. Like a free Wi-Fi router doing its best to attract all the people to a coffee shop. Nothing truly important is the honorific name this time, since Loki was sure that even if he used an incomplete one he might end up summoning the attention of the true mad god who seemed to be hovering at the edge of the battlefield for some reason. Instead, Loki used his wisdom of writing newspaper headlines. The true creator's true name revealed. The fallen creator. How to speed up an evil god's descent. Shocking. The true creator was aborted. Each headline was more interesting than the last, making sure that the knowledge was tempting enough for the person that came in contact with them that they'd expose themselves by clicking on it, or in this case, wanting to know more. And in doing so, they'd allow Loki to easily pinpoint where the knowledge went so that he could capture them after delivering an even greater shock to their minds. Except, thump. A harsh sound of something hitting the heavy metal doors rang out from the inside, causing Loki to frown as he felt a stinging pain in a part of his mind, soul and body, while simultaneously feeling a sense of weakening wash over him. Shit, was that a trap? Loki cursed in his mind at the fact that the spirit threads he'd just attached his parasites to had been almost instantly killed, as soon as they merged to take over the demigods' bodies. In the same moment, the shadows across the hallways flickered lightly before expanding suddenly as if something was being pushed outwards against them from the inside, making them bloated and stretchy. Several smooshed and distorted faces popped up on the skin of the shadow, making things look like someone was trying to push through a piece of plastic. However slowly, no matter how they tried to push through, the plastic just wouldn't give up. And so, the barrage of shadow creatures that were about to walk into the narrow shadowy tunnel were blocked off by Loki, who had used the Mentor of Deceit characteristic to deceive the boundary between the shadows and the real world in a short region around him, blocking anyone trying to exit or enter it for the moment. Chadwick meanwhile stood calmly, watching the door with great interest, as if nothing around them was of any consequence to him, as if nothing around him was even moving at all. He had been deceived. The attacks didn't stop there. Almost immediately the air around them grew thick with blood. Physical blood, taking on a reddish hue as a thin bloody mist slipped out from underneath the little cracks of the metal doors, from the hinges, the handles, the lip, and from every other gap that separated the MCCC's room inside from the corridor outside. The shadows from earlier stopped morphing according to the bodies contained within it and instead split off from the mass as flesh began to coalesce along with it to form a humanoid creature of flesh and blood. Loki flicked his hand almost instantly. His aim being one thing: to perform a theft. The birthing creature suddenly stumbled as its forming hind limbs suddenly lost a chunk of the flesh that was being used to create its muscles, making its skeletal shadow structure visible as it fell onto them and began to collapse before it could even fully stand. Loki had stolen some of its flesh. However, that had never been the demigod's plan in the first place. The open formation of a flesh and blood servant was only a distraction. Loki's all-round vision warned him of the true attack almost immediately, but it was too late. A large shadowy eye opened up right above Loki's head as it shot out a dense beam of compressed information. The beam hit Loki almost instantly, however he barely had time to react, even as he sent a Diffindo to slice the eye, causing the beam to fizzle out after drowning his entire body in itself. He was still left busy. Instead, Loki was left pointing his wand at another random spot mid-air while his body began to mutate, with chunks of his blood slowly clotting as his skin started to turn red first, then purple and finally black before it started peeling off into fleshy bits and chunks and dropping to the ground like he was decaying. A blood-dripping rose made out of freshly cut flesh was already flying towards him from the direction he was pointing his wand. So one of the demigods has grazed someone from the White Tower pathway. Loki concluded, given the unique nature of the attack where corruption was, directly, transmitted into Loki's body, something like what he'd just done. However, instead of simply corrupting his mind, it had corrupted his body directly. Loki, however, was not alarmed, or at least tried his best not to be, since he could guess that this was only a temporary setback. Although, he didn't get much of a choice in the matter, since the flesh rose that had been thrown at him when he was being drowned by the light had finally reached him. He couldn't steal the rose, as that was the same as accepting the bribe. He could have used the Mentor of Deceit characteristics to deceive the time for its activation, but he was still keeping the shadow creatures slamming themselves into the shadow wall at bay. Even if they might have been a distraction earlier, they were a real threat. Loki didn't know what kind of creatures could end up on this side, since summoning one was always a gamble. Above all, Loki didn't want to open the gates to the true creator, regardless of his reasons for staying put in the shadow world and not stepping outside to directly get him. Instead, he accepted the bribe because he had a better plan. And so, with his wand primed with spirituality, trained at the spot in the air and spoke in a sharp tone. Velox Acus. The effect was instant. The second demigod, who had been hiding in the air, turned visible as a sharp crack broke his invisibility. He was crouching on a broom, touching the ceiling, as he clutched his head and coughed blood. But Loki frowned with distaste as he noted, so he wasn't using a simple disillusionment charm after all. Loki's current Velox Acus, while not as powerfully charged as the one he'd used on Voldemort, shouldn't have caused such little reaction on a Beander who was on a pathway prone to madness, especially since the Beander didn't have any of Voldemort's excellent occlumency skills or even an outer god to protect his mind from corruption. At least that was the case the last time Loki had used the spell on a demigod of the Aurora Order, Mr. X. He'd died a pitiful death for his rank in the pecking order of Beyonders. But now the same pecking order was being rearranged, since his previously deadly spell wasn't working as intended. A coincidence? Loki didn't think so. It would have been one thing if he could see the magic, since Loki could accept that there could be someone better than him at it, but to be so good that he couldn't even detect them using spells or spirit vision. It wasn't as if the newly unveiled demigod's mind was shrouded in a dense layer of occlumency defenses. No, it was as open as the sky on a plain summer day. Loki could waltz in and waltz out as he wished, barring risking himself to corruption after spotting the true creator in the man's memories. Then why hadn't his spell worked? There could only be one other solution to the matter. It involved Beander means. An item? No. Loki didn't spot anything remotely valuable on the demigod's body other than the spirit thread hiding artifact. So the only other option was that the demigod had grazed a Sequence 5 Wraith of the Chained Pathway, someone that had an inherent defense against being mentally befuddled. After all, their spirit was strong enough to allow them to live and move around freely for a while even after their head was detached. Wraiths could turn invisible too. And so Loki concluded that one of the souls demigod 2 must have grazed was at least Wraith. It suddenly dawned on Loki just how troublesome this fight was going to be. How many souls can a demigod of the Hanged Man pathway graze again? 9. It felt rather daunting, and the burden grew. Since Loki had to finish this battle fast. At least before the Sequence 3 Templar arrived, so that his trap could be perfectly positioned. And he had to do it all without risking the demigods to madness. Hermione looked around herself in confusion. She had no idea what she had to do. She very clearly understood that this was all just some sort of a mental simulation, a dream or otherwise, but she couldn't figure out what she had to do to break out of it. For the nth time, Hermione watched as Daphne exploded right in front of her. Her arm stretched out a little as she watched Daphne's eyes turn hollow before she exploded into bits and pieces of fine mist, spraying onto her face and into her eyes before it all turned black and the cycle restarted once again. Hermione found herself a minute before Daphne was set to explode. She had originally, at the end of the last school year, been fighting through the hordes of out-of-control Beyonders at this point, trying to kill them to stay alive, running about, trying to find the smallest ways she could contribute to this messed-up world all by herself. It had been her purpose before she wanted to see Daphne again. But looking at it now, it all looked so childish. Contribute to this messed-up world. Leave a mark. When even a being as great as the Mr. Error, who seemingly had an entire epic delayed and named only for his rebirth, had so many troubles getting his name out there after it had been forgotten from history, could she, a mere sequence 7, those who were dime a dozen, truly do anything? Hermione shook her head off such depressing thoughts and dodged another blow from a corrupted Beyonder as she made her way to Daphne, in hopes of finding a way to break out of this accursed spell. How was this thing even made? I don't think my memories contain so much detail, Hermione thought as she felt the strange premonition of danger each time she intended to activate her spirit vision. She didn't dare do it, even if this was all really a dream. For the fear that her subconscious truly remembered such frightening things that could corrupt kept her choosing not to. Simultaneously she was also wondering how such things hadn't already corrupted her if she did truly remember them. Did someone mess with my memories? Single quote. No, that cannot be the case. Mr. Error would have noticed. After dodging a few more whips of pain being used on her in conjunction with bribes being thrown at her in the form of pieces of flesh which she had to dodge by simply teleporting through doors, Hermione reached Daphne's location. The world quietened unnaturally after that, as if giving her space to relive her deepest wounds before Daphne exploded. Just like that. In a shower of flesh, spraying blood on her face and into her eyes as the world faded before she was allowed to return to the start of the whole thing. Just what is it that I have to do here? Hermione asked herself frustratedly as she barely dodged a new whip of pain. She'd tried to think of not dodging during the first few runs, but the painful sensation of having her soul be wound in a barbed whip wasn't something she was keen on bearing, imaginary or not. How do I even know what those whips will even feel like? It's not like I've even ever been hit by them. Hermione created a new door, teleported to Daphne and still found that she'd arrived just in time for her closest friend to explode. As if the entire memory was just mocking her. Telling her effort no matter how well timed or placed was going to be worthless in the end. Single quote. Hermione stood defeated. It had been a good couple dozen tries until now. And she hadn't stumbled upon a single lead. And with no clue on how to save Daphne, Hermione finally snapped. This time instead of fighting to go to her, Hermione chose the easy way out. She created a door, teleported right into her home and flung herself under the cover of her blanket. One could vaguely see the trembling of the contours as it shifted slightly under the moonlight, but Hermione didn't let out a sound. Her break was cut short however when Hermione realized Daphne had died again and she'd found herself back at the start. Only this time with a slightly scrunched up expression that was holding back tears that didn't exist. Belmont stood at the foot of the mountain. I feel like this has happened before. He couldn't quite put it, but he had this feeling like he'd felt this exact feeling of feeling déjà vu before. The view of the mansion that sat at the peak under the thundering clouds seemed familiar. Well, it should be familiar, I'd be worried if it wasn't. Belmont told himself something he'd already told himself several times before as he continued walking to the top. He walked on the main pathway turned untrodden which indicated that though thoroughly visible, the mansion was rarely visited, while humming a simple tune he'd heard from his mother when he was a wee little baby, while his mind recited the song he'd thought he'd long forgotten but somehow still remembered today. Horn blows the bill and horn blows the keat. Both go up the hill and both go with feet. Hopping to the mill and hopping to the beat. Bop goes the bill and bop goes the cheat. Happy with their ends to meet and happy with their ends to meet. It wasn't a particularly good poem for a child to have heard, but growing up as a vampire wasn't a particularly happy job. And so each vampire mother often told this poem to their younglings, hoping that they'd become wise like Bill and not ever have fun, or they'd get labeled a cheat and be sent somewhere to have their ends met. It was of paramount importance in the cult of vampires that no vampire ever acted like one. Firstly, because the Muggles would get too scared and come wielding silver bullets and holding crosses. But secondly, because advancing along the vampire pathway simply meant death. As long as you weren't approved to grow stronger by the Elder Council, even collecting funds for the ingredients of the next potion was seen as treason and reason enough to be sentenced to a beheading. Of course, vampires that didn't interact much with the outside world didn't know about the acting method, and so to them it was just a silly little poem. But not for Belmont. He worked for the Ministry. Under Madame Bones, someone who'd rescued him years prior when his mum had been killed by a vampire elder, his father, who'd gone mad midway through. And ever since then, Madame Bones had given him a spot at the Ministry after looking at his pitiful status. Of course, Madame Bones even only knew he existed because she was friends with his mum before, at Hogwarts when his mum hadn't been turned. And right now Belmont was about to go back to the elders of the family that murdered his mother to discuss with them something, much like Madame Bones had done for him years prior. Belmont stepped into the manor wordlessly. There were no guards. Anyone daring enough to have come in here was either a meal or allowed to come in by the elder in the manor. Anyone else would have been sacrificed before they even knew what had happened. He walked through the corridors, familiar with the surroundings since their layout seemed fresh in his mind. Another déjà vu. Single quote. Single quote. What a strange day. Belmont continued humming the other verses, feeling the song unusually clear today as he chalked it up to a faint figment of his imagination like the déjà vu from earlier. Belmont's eyes paused at several corners of the manor, noticing the little details he'd carved into the marble stone using his nails while he waited patiently for his mother to pick him up. A few scratches from when he was dragged away by the shadows and beaten up thoroughly for simply snacking on blood-flavored lollipops too loud. A deep gash from when he'd accidentally cracked the marble after being thrashed because he had sneezed on the ingredients for a brew and ruined them. The lights dimmed as he stepped down the stairs, walking faster and faster as his steps echoed through the mostly empty corridors. Eventually he reached the cellars, standing in front of an ornate and heavy marble gate filled with carvings of beautiful women. He was about to raise his hand to knock, but before he could, "Come in," an aged voice sounded from inside. Taking a deep breath to suppress his frustrating anger at the voice, Belmont exhaled with a sigh and stepped into the room after pushing the heavy doors open. Inside was an old man resting in a coffin. He looked like he had a foot in the grave. His eyes ran over Belmont's body, sending a slight chill up his spine. Irreconcilably for Belmont, however, the old man gave off a feeling of warmth and acceptance, much like the irradiant full moon. "Belmont, it's good to. I'm here for this," Belmont said softly as he placed the letter in his hands on the elder's desk, which was in front of his coffin. The elder gave him a wry smile as he mumbled under his breath, "Not even going to greet your grandfather." The elder slowly stood up, his every move sending a creak through the coffin's aged wood as he pushed himself and picked up the letter placed just out of his reach. There was a hint of grace in his movements, as if every movement was meant for show. An exaggerated ritual of expression and affection to the wind around him. Picking up the letter and looking at the Wizengamot crest on it, he frowned. And even before he opened it, he looked up at Belmont with a frown. "Is this about Severus?" Belmont looked straight in the elder's eyes and nodded without hesitation. The elder sighed deeply, the dim lighting catching his wrinkles and making him look even older as he slumped back into his coffin. He stuffed the letter into the side of his coffin before speaking softly, a single word that was his answer. "No." He then closed his eyes and went to sleep. Belmont, however, stood right there. He didn't move, not even after 30 minutes. And when the elder finally couldn't take it anymore, he said, "Fine." A hint of a smile appeared on Belmont's face, but it vanished just as quickly as it arrived. He turned around with the same frown he'd walked in and walked out of the room. Suddenly, however, the shadows all around him deepened, darkened, and then engulfed the world before Belmont found himself at the start once again. He stood at the foot of the mountain. I feel like this has happened before. Ron looked at the short menagerie he'd created in the short time he'd spent trapped in his childhood. It was strange since he still had his adult body, but he spent his time around the house doing things he used to do when he was a kid. Getting scolded by mom. Eating. Getting scolded by mom. Playing. Staring at the Weasley clock. Getting scolded by mom. Eating. Getting scolded by mom. Playing. Staring at the Weasley clock. Getting scolded by mom. Eating. Getting scolded by mom. Sleeping. It was a fun time of watching over the memories of his family that seemed to have come alive in the confines of his mind, of this spell, but only for a few days since. The days never passed by, that, he was sure of. Since each day he woke up he'd find himself back on the day Fred and George had pranked him during his childhood by turning his favorite stuffed teddy into a large acromantula spider. Ron had already tried killing the spider, brewing a potion with the spider eye, cooking the spider, even eating the spider after a few hundred days. But nothing had broken it. Nothing had broken this loop. And so he declared his previous life a figment of his imagination while living this life to its fullest. Of course, such a resolve didn't even last a day before he'd kicked himself into shape to think of a solution to get out of this problem. Hermione is probably in danger, and if she is not, then she's probably worried, and I need to help everyone else anyway. What would they ever do without the great me? With that thought, Ron focused his entire mind and came up with a list of solutions and started trying them out one by one iteration after the other. He didn't have any extraordinary wizarding skills or any extraordinary Beander abilities. So all he had left was using his mind to brute force things. Ron looked at his assistant. So Mr. Harry 8 Eyes. Ready to see who'll win? And asked while looking it in all its 8 eyes. The transfigured spider, a product of accidental magic from Fred, quivered. It could feel that whatever was about to happen next was something wicked. Ron pulled out a garden gnome from his pocket and placed it on the same table as the spider. He prodded the garden gnome a little to get its attention since it was still a little dizzy from having been twirled around before it was picked up so that it could be stored silently. The gnome blinked for a few seconds before spotting the spider in front of it and looking at it with delight. Free food. Who could say no to that after all? Just as the gnome was about to rush at the spider, however, Ron grabbed it by the head, holding it in place for a second as he gave the spider a soft look of pity since it had been subject to the most inhumane of experiments until now. But then Ron quickly shook his head. No. How can I feel pity for my enemy? And the gnome was allowed to rush towards the spider again. The ensuing battle was short. The dumb spider couldn't do much else other than sit around and look at things. So it only squealed as it was eaten alive by the gnome before the world went black and Ron woke up again. Right beside his spider as it sat there on his face, mocking him, and telling him just how fruitless his efforts to escape it were. Damn spiders. I'm starting to truly hate them. Welcome to Fanfic Audiobook, your go-to place for immersive audiobooks. If you enjoy the content, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to our channel for more amazing stories. And please support the author by link in description. Tonks sat up on her bed, her head swimming with confusion as she looked around herself before she paused for a minute and sighed. She could feel that something was wrong with the world around her. Something was keeping her awake. An instinct of sorts which kept making her feel like there was something observing her, evaluating her and keeping her here. What's wrong? Tonks questioned herself, not even pulling open her timetable like she usually did after getting up in the morning. Instead she closed her eyes and began to calm herself, trying to spend some time, soul-searching, so that she could figure out what was making her feel so weird. Did I forget to do my potions homework? No, Professor Snape's been busy with brewing something recently and didn't want to give us any homeworks that he'd have to spend time correcting. Perhaps I forgot to send a letter to Mom. Oh no. I totally forgot. Tonks quickly opened her eyes, grabbed her bag before rushing to the Ollery where she could use one of the owl spirits that Hogwarts had to send a message to her mum. Along the way she made sure to glare at any of the boys that her instincts warned her about before finally stepping into the Ollery. Except as soon as she stepped there she grew confused. Question mark. Where did all the owl spirits go? Huh, wait a second, Hogwarts. Didn't I graduate from here a long time ago? Suddenly she felt an instinctive sense of danger as the entire world around her collapsed and she awoke with a jerky start, snapping up straight on her chair as she pulled out her wand and aimed it at the person right in front of her, almost blowing them up if not for the control she had on herself. Good, Moody said softly, taking a step away from Tonks while his magical eye still kept a tight lock on Tonks' body of heart and mind. That was unnecessary. A now grown-up Tonks complained. Unnecessary? Moody asked, raising his eyebrows as he normal eye fixed on Tonks, drool on her chin causing her to feel flushed before quickly wiping it away. Constant vigilance, Moody said again, turning around this time as Tonks quickly followed after him while still muttering under her breath. Seriously? Just because I fell asleep after constantly chasing those evil cultists yesterday you put me into a mental loop where my room was blowing up. I blew up 17 times. Who does that to their one and only apprentice? I'd rather clean a dragon's enclosure than feel the sensation of being blown up again. Just as Tonks was about to continue further, Moody stopped in front of the elevator and turned around to look at her. No way. I'm not cleaning any enclosures as a favor. Tonks immediately reacted, knowing the last time she did her teacher such a favor she found herself scrubbing away at the walls of a stinky shack for hours because she couldn't use magic as it would have disturbed the magical animals inside. Mum even barred me from entering the house for a week, you know. Tonks said grumpily while quickly arranging her hair and clothes, since they seemed to be going somewhere important if they were using the private elevator of the Auror office. Moody huffed and waited for the elevator in silence, entering it with Tonks when it arrived before thumping his staff on its floor to select the floor. The elevator itself moved soundlessly, but the thin sound of it cutting through winds at high speed still remained, giving Tonks the weird feeling of riding a broomstick without actually riding one. It wasn't long before they arrived, however, and Tonks found herself surprised as she stepped out. Department of Law Enforcement. We're going on a private mission this time then? Tonks asked, since they'd gone on such missions plenty of times these last few days where Moody had been training her for the official Auror exams so that she could quickly become part of the force. And while Tonks was glad that someone as legendary as Moody was giving her a hands-on training, which mostly meant hands-off since he barely did anything as he believed in letting people learn from their mistakes, she also secretly felt a little dissatisfied since she could see that most other Aurors weren't even on her level from right when she'd graduated. Some couldn't even properly cast a shield charm, forget about complicated things like breaking through legilimency spells that Moody put her through when she was caught off guard. She also secretly felt that Moody just wanted her to lose her limbs like him so she could truly look the part of being his apprentice. But she never said such thoughts out loud. She knew better than others that saying that would only earn her extra time in more hands-on training. No missions, Moody simply said, before walking ahead as if he wasn't going to entertain any further questions. Tonks was not one to back down though. Her curiosity had been piqued and she knew best that Moody couldn't say no to her. He was almost close family to her at this point since her mum had even invited Moody to their house for dinners, and that was from a mum who was fiercely protective of the rule of keeping business and family separated. She still remembered the time when her mum had set her father's case files on fire simply because they were lying on the table during dinner. So while Tonks still had to make sure to clean up the smell of strange herbs and potions that Moody brought along with him under the strictest inspections from her mother accompanied by the smug laughter of her father at not having to do any work or help out, she didn't find it awfully terrible. If anything, she'd come to regard Moody as a sort of grandfather she'd never had. Then who are we going to meet? Tonks blurted out. Moody's face remained stoic but his lips twitched slightly. He stayed silent for a bit, as he tried to stop himself but he ended up speaking anyway. Office head, Amelia Bones. Tonks' eyes widened. The Bones name was quite famous among the Aurors. Amelia was someone legendary in the British Wizarding Isles. If Professor McGonagall was seen as the strongest woman of her era, then Amelia Bones was the strongest woman of the current era. She'd single-handedly outgrown those who'd started off at the same rank as her even while they had the full support and backing of the snobby purebloods. Her grip over her operations and people was so firm that she reigned unimpeded even through Voldemort's reign of terror, even when the then Minister Harold Mincham, a hardliner, failed to keep the dissenting voices in check. If the British wizarding world was at peace today and truly believed that they could find and trust in the authority of the ministry, it was purely because of Amelia Bones and her ability to keep the corrupt officials busy with everything else other than justice. Of course, sometimes external interference was inevitable, but if Amelia personally involved herself in something, justice was most certainly the only outcome. Seriously? Tonks asked after calming down a little, but still failing to keep the excitement in check. Moody gave her a short glance and what Tonks noticed was an unmistakable frown, as if he'd felt hurt in some way, but Moody never answered again. Instead they carried on through the Department of Magical Law Enforcement in silence. They had to wait for a few minutes outside Amelia's office before the receptionist said they could go in, but the time didn't get the least bit boring for ever the most inquisitive Tonks. Instead, as soon as they stepped into the waiting area by the office, Tonks began to most noticeably fangirl about things with the way she was ogling every single bit of the space as if afraid to miss anything about the legendary figure. There were antique paintings filled with seemingly legendary battles happening in them, a couple of antique-looking vases that seemed to jitter around every few seconds as if they'd trapped something evil inside them, along with a bunch of smaller trinkets that happened to be gifts from various countries that Amelia seemed to have been to or helped in some way. But most notable of all was the lectern sitting in front of the center of the far wall of the room, upon which rested a simple book underneath a large painting of Amelia herself. Not containing the urge to flick through such an obviously placed book, Tonks quickly walked up to it and studied it, only to realize that it was a book she had in her home too. It was the British Wizarding World's Magical Law Compendium. Although she'd stuffed her copy that she'd received when she joined the ministry in some corner and promptly forgotten about it, Amelia seemed to have treasured hers greatly. Tonks scratched her head in slight embarrassment as she looked up at the portrait that was similarly looking at her in amusement as it shook its head softly like it was amused for the child's future before going back to sipping on its tea. "You may enter," the receptionist suddenly said after a few unscrupulous-looking members of the Parliament left Amelia's office with expressions of dissatisfaction and slight anger. Tonks nodded excitedly as she quickly grabbed Moody's hand for support, just so that he could stop her in case she pounced on Amelia to bludgeon her with questions. Moody snorted but didn't let go of her hand as they entered the office space. The first thing Tonks felt was that it was abnormal. Something about the place felt eerie, as if there was a heavy sense of oppression that lingered in the air. It caused Tonks to straighten up, tense a little and take a step closer to Moody, even though she was a fully graduated student of Hogwarts certified by the charms professor and an adult herself. It almost felt like she couldn't even breathe without permission in this place. Something about the space filled her with worry. Especially when Tonks failed to find Amelia in the office anywhere. A desk at the far end of the room that had piled up papers looked empty without its owner. The chair turned slightly to the right to indicate that someone had left it recently since it had not been corrected by the house elves. The room was lit by a single tall ornate stained glass window placed directly behind the chair. The figure of the woman of justice was collaged on it, giving one a vague feeling of being watched in spite of the blindfold on her head. Suddenly the blindfold lifted to reveal a set of ornate lifelike golden eyes. They were made of tiny pieces of golden glass that bent light in a way to carve out the thin streaks in an iris as they followed everyone's gaze. However, as soon as the figure in the stained glass met Tonks' eyes, it relaxed, the aura emitting from it diminished before receding entirely along with the figure itself, leaving behind a simple stained glass window with flower patterns on it. The entire experience left Tonks with a heavy feeling of confusion and mental exhaustion. At least until, a door on the right wall creaked open as a woman walked out while wiping her hands on the towel attached to it. She looked at Tonks first, a little confused before looking at Moody and releasing what was happening. She then looked at the window and smiled lightly. "Pardon me for that. It was a defense mechanism that activates when I'm not here and someone of considerable importance walks in." Forgiveness was a far thing for Tonks, who had already forgotten the reason for her fear. Instead it was Moody who was actively trying to stop the girl from walking over to Amelia and grabbing her hand to question her about her entire life. Amelia chuckled softly seeing Tonks so excited, causing the girl to blush embarrassingly before turning to Moody. "I suppose she is your suggestion." Moody nodded wordlessly. "Sigh, all this time I've been pleading with you to take on an apprentice and you've rejected me, and now you come up with a girl I know nothing about." Moody only snorted gruffly and said nothing else, but his meaning was clear. No one was good enough. The vote of confidence filled Tonks with a little pride, causing her to push her chest out a little with a fulfilled smile. Amelia chuckled some more before looking at Tonks with a serious expression as she spoke calmly. "I suppose you've seen these before." Amelia's hands waved on the desk and produced three weirdly shaped illusory black lips, all emitting an eerie and strange whispers that affected one's ability to think clearly, constantly making them feel and want to act out degenerate things. Tonks nodded, immediately turning serious when work was mentioned. "They are, the spoils of my last mission," she said, slightly unsure where this was going as she looked at Moody, who only gave her a soft and reassuring nod. Amelia nodded. I see. She then turned to Moody and gave him a short glare. You didn't tell her anything, did you? Moody stayed silent, but one could see how gleeful he was, but Amelia was clearly annoyed. She had a lot more things to do than going about introducing someone to the Beander world. And while it did seem interesting to see the shock of other people when they found out about it at first, it was only good for once or twice. She'd grown old now, and such things only made her annoyed. Why had she even hired so many people in the first place? Wasn't it so that they could take care of these silly things themselves? Now here she was, introducing another newbie. Quote. Tonks stood confused. She looked at the collection of small eerie lips and grew even more confused. Was there something special about them? She'd obtained them from the small group of evil cultists she'd defeated last night. They seemed to be holding a ritual to sacrifice someone to what they thought was a god. They didn't really know a lot of magic other than rituals, since she'd taken them out rather easily with a few simple chain spells, and the ritual seemed to have backfired at that point and caused them to drop dead and produce those eerie items which she confiscated and returned to Moody when she was back. It was a simple mission, really. Simpler than most others, where she had to run about and ask people about things, interrogate them, collect clues and solve various problems without letting anyone know of her actions. However, another possibility clawed its way into her mind from the subconscious. Perhaps she was cursed by the ritual in some way. And it's a rather harsh curse which could kill her immediately if not treated. Tonks' eyes widened. She looked at Amelia with shock and surprise, but Amelia put a rest to her question even before she could ask it. No, it's not a curse and your life is not in danger. Amelia shook her head. These are Beander characteristics. Tonks only stood in silence after that, quietly listening to Amelia describe to her the secretive world of Beyonders. Her mind vaguely tried to process how an entire world lived alongside the wizarding world that the wizards knew nothing about. Was this how Muggles felt when they were told about magic? Tonks asked herself, finding it rather troublesome to match what she was listening to with her own experiences. So you want me to become this, Beander? Then, Tonks asked softly, causing Amelia to nod, making Tonks give her an unwilling expression. But, don't worry, I'm not asking you to choose their pathway and become an evil cultist like them. Amelia reassured, I want you to become a member of my pathway. Tonks' eyes instantly brightened up. And before she could control herself, she nodded. Except before she could say another word, the world around her shattered, and she awoke once again in her bed at Hogwarts. Huh. Tonks looked around in confusion for a second as a strange sense that something was wrong overtook her senses for a second before she quickly opened her timetable where she saw the words constant vigilance. Before her room exploded with a bang. Nicholas looked at Prunell for the umpteenth time. What's going on here? Nicholas asked with a slight frown on his face as he felt puzzled about what he'd gotten himself stuck in. This wasn't the real world, that much he was sure of. He'd started off believing that this place was his mindscape. Except the more time he spent here, restarting over and over, only to watch Prunell slip through his hands, the surer he became that this wasn't even anywhere inside his body of heart and mind, no matter how similar it felt or looked. So the only other option was clear. It's almost as if I've been brought to a new place entirely. Nicholas thought with a deeper frown because he didn't know. He didn't know what the nature of this new place was. It seemed to somehow be able to recreate his life in excruciating detail. It wasn't the real world or his mindscape, and he couldn't feel the outside world from wherever here was. Is this the Divan? No, that can't be it. As such, Nicholas was truly puzzled. He couldn't understand what had trapped him so thoroughly. He'd tried to connect to the spirit world to escape through it earlier, but he'd failed. He couldn't even feel the connection of his spirit to the spirit world. Is the only way to ask them for help. Nicholas frowned. He tried bringing up the runes that powered this place for the final time before giving up, since there were no runes. This was clearly the work of a Beander's abilities, but Nicholas just couldn't figure it out. A Beander pathway connected to an entirely new world. The world around him collapsed once again as he returned to Prunell's side. He looked at her delicate face that was rapidly turning pale as thick branches grew around her heart. This was a scene from his past. Something he hadn't ever let anyone know. Well, except Loki. It was when Prunell had nearly died after visiting the abyss. Of course the scenario in front of him was blatantly false since Prunell had survived, or he'd have died with her. But it being false probably wasn't without reason. Prunell in the past had only survived because she'd managed to snag access to the uniqueness of the Arbiter pathway for a few minutes before being forced to lose it lest she risk being corrupted by her, again because she had her attention on it. At least this thing can't recreate the uniquenesses of pathways. Or maybe whatever this is just hasn't needed to do so yet. Nicholas doubted himself, since something that could trap an angel was likely capable of creating a uniqueness if only for a short duration. Nicholas's brain fired as the thought sparked a chain reaction in his extraordinary mind. Dominoes fell as his face turned ashen. He'd realized what he had to do. It was just that he wasn't confident he'd be able to live peacefully after he did what he was about to do. Bastard. What a despicable man. I underestimated it when Dumbledore told me that he was the only person capable of fighting Grindelwald. I thought he meant it only casually, not literally. A bitter taste lingered in Nicholas's mouth as the feeling of regret flew off his tongue. The world collapsed once again as a fresh Prunell came into view. Nicholas lifted his hand but paused since his eyes still hadn't firmed. I don't even know how all this works. Wouldn't it be too risky to act? Or is that also just another part of this little game? Nicholas closed his eyes and consolidated everything he'd seen so far to make sure that what he was going to do next wasn't the wrong thing to do. This place wasn't in the spirit world. It wasn't the astral world or even a mindscape. And it definitely wasn't the real world. He didn't know what this place was. Or how it could replicate everything about his life so perfectly by making Prunell seem so lifelike by making her share their personal memories, as if someone had been sitting right beside them and watching them speak. So there was no way to retaliate. He couldn't break the system. And so he could only resort to studying the system to break its purpose. What could the purpose of such a system be? A system where he'd have to watch the death of his beloved any number of times while preventing him from changing the outcome in any way. Merely a delay for Grindelwald to use it to escape. Hardly. If Grindelwald truly wanted to remain hidden and reach his destination, he would have never been seen in the first place. After all, clearly, the man had some mysticism knowledge that Nicholas himself completely lacked even after being alive for an amount of time much longer than him. What was this place? The legendary Forgotten Land of Gods. Nicholas chuckled, he truly didn't know. He would have tried contacting Mr. Error here if that were the case since it might have interested him. But Nicholas couldn't even begin to feel the spirit world. Either way, what remained true was the fact that Grindelwald had used something big on him. So this was always the plan. After all, no one would use something so cleverly built, a trump card, on their whims and fancies. So using it to trap him had definitely been the plan all along. It seems Grindelwald's seer abilities aren't for show. He seems to have foreseen our interruptions and planned accordingly to keep us trapped. And if I'm right, he wants to make sure that we can never advance further and only regress, at least for a short duration from after we break this trap he's sprung onto us. The world dissolved under Nicholas's raised hand once again and reformed with Prunell showing an expression of defeated pain but acceptance. There was a smile on her face like she'd seen her death coming and had made peace with it. She stretched her hand out to Nicholas and spoke calmly with a soothing tone. It's all right, Nick. I'm sure we'll meet again, elsewhere. Nicholas's heart ached for what he was about to do, but he pushed away his fears since he believed none of this was real, and thrust his hand forward. A dense congregation of spirituality erupted out of Nicholas's hands. Having become an alchemist by the means of his pathway, Nicholas had a fundamental principle. True alchemy was the one aspect of mysticism that involved transforming life itself. It wasn't like the other pathways which played with life on the surface. While the other pathways that dealt with life, the planter, the corpse collector and the apothecary pathway all molded it in some shape or form, only the paragon pathway had the ability to deconstruct it. To rewrite it and change its fundamental nature. It could change a human into a demon and a demon back into a human. Of course the price was something neither side would ever be willing to pay, but it was still an option. And this essence of being able to manipulate life was what Nicholas feared and revered the most. As a young alchemist he'd been full of fire, wanting to explore the limits of his reach irrespective of its repercussions. He'd attempted to tame life itself. To make himself immortal even before he'd reached sequence 3. And in doing so he manipulated the life of someone else for the first time. Nicholas still remembered very clearly what he'd done. In an attempt to escape death, to make sure he remained immortal, he'd studied the methods of all the various pathways. And of all of those he could get his hands on, the most invulnerable were those of the Aurora Order. A near-perfect body that could heal itself with the help of any other Beander, regardless of their pathway. On top of that they did something truly baffling. It was a well-known fact that one's spirituality could not be controlled by someone else since it was your essence, it stemmed from your soul and acted as its external aura, something unique to you. Yet those of the secret suppliant pathway could break this rule. They could graze those of other pathways, and then use their souls to command total control over the spirituality of others. They could freely use the abilities of other pathways using the spirituality of the souls they'd captured. And they could do it all without losing control. Truly strange. But Nicholas then found it fascinating. And as such he'd studied a number of them. He'd dissected numerous Aurora Order fanatics just to see how they would heal if he subjected them to every possible method of inflicting harm he knew. He wanted to see how they could so proficiently control the spirituality of others so that he could steal the method for himself and use magic to replicate it. While nothing came of this madness since the idea was rather naive and flawed in its essence since it required merging non-adjacent pathways, it was also something that had allowed Nicholas to delve into the depths of the human soul. And in doing so he developed something a little special. But even trying it just once had caused him to swear it off forever. He'd promised even Purnell that he'd never touch it again. But fate was always a fickle thing and played with you in funny ways. Somehow now he was using this cursed knowledge of his on his beloved to save himself. He truly didn't know who was right or wrong in this situation. An inherent sense of wrongness formed in his heart as he continued. The dense congregation of spirituality in Nicholas's hands flickered for a moment before condensing into a bright pearl. The pearl hovered above Purnell's face for a moment as she looked at him with warmth and love. "Ah, sending me off with a beautiful gift, dearie. I love it." The soft words caused Nicholas's face to scrunch up. Purnell clearly didn't recognize a spell she should have and it ticked Nicholas off. He didn't know how Grindelwald knew about this spell of his, but it not being replicated in Purnell's memories just to make him see her suffer through it snapped something inside him. But he didn't stop. "You wanted me to become a monster, then a monster I shall become. The situations don't define who I am. I'll make sure I'm just as sane as you are after all this, Grindelwald." As the pearl touched Purnell's skin it suddenly sank into her body. Except instead of the relief that Purnell was waiting for, only hell waited for her. Her eyes widened instantly as she looked at Nicholas with terror. Nick!" Purnell shouted, her body trembling wildly, blood spraying out of every pore as the branches on her body quickly grew stronger with her losing the focus and the energy to fight against them. An expression of betrayal painted her face as Purnell suddenly felt herself lose control of her body. Her own soul betrayed her as it split. First into 2 fragments before into 4 and then innumerable. She was forced to watch from every single fragment as she was absorbed into Nicholas, piece by piece, with her mind being locked behind a cage that could only see, but not do. Nicholas had it worse. As he watched the body of his beloved wife disintegrate he felt an exhilarating sense of joy and jubilation. He was forced to. And immediately after, his mind collapsed. A heavy wave of darkness engulfed it as his own mind was assaulted by the whispers of multiple deranged and maddened beings, each rushing to eat his soul, grab a piece for themselves so that they could gain what he was taking for himself. Loki looked around himself. This is not, Right then Loki spotted a spirit body thread across the corridor, one he didn't immediately recognize and paused to change his words. Good, A few minutes earlier, Loki ducked, barely dodging a flying eye that spawned out of the bloody mist in the air as it shot another thick beam of light towards his head. In the same moment however, Loki felt his body freeze. A strange sense of weakness washed over Loki's senses as he began to hear the quietness of death approaching within the distant echo of his mind. His thoughts that had been flying at speeds comparable to light slowed down. The once chaotic mess inside his head started to turn into a soothing lullaby. His control over the shadows around him blocked by the mentor of deceit characteristics shattered, but the tide of creatures they were holding back didn't arrive. Instead, the shadows cascaded everywhere. Like a smooth gradient, expanding ever so slightly in an infinite manner before covering his entire vision as if wanting to swallow him whole. And he could do nothing but watch as his mind slowed down to a crawl since he had accepted the bribe in the form of a flesh rose earlier which made him weaker to his enemy. Except Loki wasn't helpless. Had it been earlier, when he was still a mere sequence 5 and couldn't split off worms of time, Loki would have failed miserably to save himself. So Grindelwald's here. And he's interfering so blatantly. Why don't I see him then? Psychological invisibility. Loki's mind spat out the conclusion his decryption abilities had given him prior to when his mind had slowed and concluded in an instant when the event had started. And as such, the reaction his mind had prepared in that moment occurred belatedly. Loki's hand automatically flicked, his mind pointed at his spirit body thread which he stole instantly. Except a few excruciating moments of what felt like hours of silence passed as Loki watched the shadows slowly expanding in his vision before. Loki's head slowed to a sluggish crawl. He was barely having a thought anymore, much less a stream of ideas. Nonetheless, his limited capacities didn't resort to fear. Instead, Loki's figure flickered momentarily as the beam of light spawning from the eye he'd just dodged passed straight through him before solidifying right as it ended, giving any observers the illusion that he was formed of air and the beam of light had passed right through him. A worm in the Saphira castle had automatically stolen his space and sent him into the Sephiroth through their shared connection with the help of the Mentor of Deceit characteristics. He left an illusion in his place of course, and since he was only gone for a moment shorter than a moment, it went unnoticed as he cleansed himself in the grey fog. Loki, who'd just reappeared in place of the now gone illusion, looked at the shadows that had already receded and then at the demigod who had put him in such a state in mere moments and frowned. Death Envoy. A shudder passed his spine as Loki realized the domain of death seemingly had no effect on spirit body threads and brought death in more mysterious ways. He hadn't seen his fate get bent to death or even warn him about what had happened. Is it because the death was not confirmed? Loki thought, but immediately ruled out the question since he'd have at least felt a sense of danger wash over him if that was the case. But he'd felt nothing, not even in the moment he was about to die if he did nothing. It had truly blindsided him and taken him by surprise in this case. It was all a bit too sudden. Loki thought, but didn't have the time to pursue said thought since he suddenly felt a grave sense of danger from every wall around him. Loki watched in surprise as the blood mist that had condensed on the walls and the ground suddenly solidified. Not into blocks of ice or even rivers of blood. No, they solidified into a flesh rug. Loki cursed internally while thinking of the demigod who was stuck inside the safe room. He'd initially thought that the demigod was staying in there since he'd been hurt by Loki's attempt at parasitizing him earlier, especially because of the loud heavy thud on the iron door from earlier. Never did I think they'd employ every technique to kill me. They're even camping inside unreachable areas. What the hell is this? Who balanced this level? First there's the true creator camping in the shadow realm, then there's his minions camping in closed rooms. And then there's Grindelwald camping somewhere I can't see him, probably waiting for the right moment to strike when I least expect it. Why's this lobby filled with so many campers and tryhards? Whatever, I'll definitely have the last laugh since time is in my favor, I just need to bait out the last demigod. Loki paused for a moment before he added while feeling a little ominous. At least until the true rapper doesn't show up. While Loki raged about the shitty matchmaking, the demigod who'd just unleashed the Death Envoy wasn't so calm. His eyes widened as he realized that Loki seemed to have tanked what was a summon of a fully digested Sequence 5 gatekeeper after being debuffed by a bribe and then proceeded to stand there normally like nothing had ever happened with all the damage fully reversed. Even he'd have been coughing up bits of flesh to force his body to discard the pieces touched by death if he were to be touched by the call from beyond the veil. His eyes narrowed as the heat in his blood burned with a raging frenzy. The boy has already learnt not to mess with our thoughts after the first time he used it on E. and was detected. It's just like Lord Templar told us. The boy learns fast. But we must not let Lord Templar down, for that would be letting down the Lord. While the plan had been shifted slightly ahead of schedule because of Loki arriving so deep into their trap unharmed and without any interruptions, time was still on their side. As long as they could stretch the battle out even to just a few more minutes, Loki would slip eventually, and with the three of them there they'd make sure they'd do their darn best to make it happen right when Lord Templar arrived at their location. He'd wondered why Lord Templar hadn't just arrived through the shadows, but kept the thought to himself, for he wasn't a traitor who would question his authority. The demigod suddenly raised his hand while making a strange gesture towards the now freed shadows. His fingers first just bent unnaturally, as if flexible to the point of being able to flex backwards, but soon they bent enough to touch their own knuckles, causing Loki to almost gag at the demigod in disgust. With his fingers bent backwards, the shadows that were once stuck to the space around them bent unnaturally, causing the walls they were a part of to crack visibly and audibly. Loki kept one eye on these new shadows as he nimbly dodged the flesh and blood bombs exploding on the fresh flesh rug that was created to encompass the entire area. He thieved the flesh from a couple dozen, causing them to explode on the spot, sending flesh and blood flying in a smaller range than otherwise as they splattered onto the rug itself and merged with it to form another fresh new round. He ducked underneath another batch of thick fleshy projectiles that were flying towards him and about to explode before deceiving them of their targets, sending them barreling towards the second demigod who was striking the same pose from earlier with his fingers curling backwards. Loki frowned lightly and checked the shadows. No movement. The shadows hadn't budged after they'd cracked the concrete. What is he doing? It seemed that whatever the demigod was doing hadn't worked, yet. Emoting. But he hasn't even killed me. At least not yet, Loki thought as he sent a few more projectiles the demigod's way while exploding a few more by thieving their flesh away. And while he hadn't expected the projectiles to do much of anything, Loki frowned when the demigod simply let them collide with his body and then merge into it. What is this? Anti-friendly fire. He was about to flick his wand at the demigod who was stuck posing when a vague premonition of danger however alerted Loki's senses. Not from the shadows, but from the air around him. Though he wasn't given time to think about it since, almost instantly, Loki felt a shift in fate of the world around him. The explosive flesh and blood all around him had corroded the floor, which caused him to misstep. His feet, usually extremely balanced and well positioned for escape at a moment's notice, had not expected to lose footing so suddenly. His posture followed his slip. His knee buckled as he landed directly in the path of a freshly forming fleshy projectile. At that key moment, just as Loki was about to recover and dodge the projectile, the posing demigod's head snapped in his direction. In an instant Loki felt his feet slip magnified. What was a movement of a few centimeters turned into nearly an entire couple meters as Loki performed a mid-battle split as his entire body tumbled towards the fleshy rug that was simply waiting to entrap and merge into him. Loki fought for control but only managed to change the outcome by a little. He was still in the projectile's way, however he managed to save himself from the rug, holding back at the last second as he only stepped onto it with a single foot instead of planting himself face first into it. In the time it took to think about a reaction, Loki's hands moved automatically. A spell slipped out wandlessly, torching the rug underneath his feet that was reaching over while his eyes locked onto the flesh bombs flying his way. It's so poorly made, Loki commented mentally, noting how the flesh bomb wasn't as spherical as before, as if created in a hurry. Are they even trying to stall me anymore? His thoughts wandered mid-battle. It's becoming so obvious that they're holding back and waiting for the Templar to gang up on me all at once, Loki frowned. He reached out with his mind and stole the flesh of the bomb like before, causing it to blast with him just out the radius, except. Huh! Loki exclaimed as a throbbing ache filled his head. Fate seemed to have interfered again. The flesh bomb that Loki stole this time was different. In retrospect, a different shaped grenade should have instantly sent Loki's bells on alarm, but he wasn't a flesh connoisseur. You couldn't fault him for not noticing changes in one piece of meat from another, at least not until you factored in his sensitive vision. Loki's nose bled in spurts as an explosion of corrupting information hammered away at his head. He flicked his hand in a quick attempt to save himself, but even after he'd attempted to steal the information bombarding his mind, the theft after a long time. Damnation. Failed. And as if on cue, the corrupting information in his mind exploded in a raging tide. Occlumency helped almost instantly as Loki's mental defenses he'd formed using runes pointing to Salazar and himself worked along with the worms of time on standby in the Saphira castle to keep his sanity as he was bombarded with images of the true creator. Loki flicked his wand this time. His spirituality poured into his mind to strengthen his mental defensive framework that was being rapidly corroded while in the real world Loki flicked his wand again. Mens Velox Acus. Loki used the spell and targeted it at the corruption within his own mind. However, fate betrayed him once again as the spell meant for the corruption in Loki's mind was distorted. Loki sensed the distortion at the last second as he intensified his control over his spell to fight it off. Alas, he could only do so much while his mind was listening to a rap god. The spell targeting his own occlumency defenses barely veered off course and exploded inside his mind in the already corrupted region. It happened in the enemies territory of the corrupt information, but given its uncontrolled nature due to him empowering it so heavily at the last second, Loki felt even worse. He felt a strong surge up in his body of heart and mind. If he were to wager, Loki was sure not even the bravest of souls would go surfing in his polluted sea of subconscious right now given the dust that had just been kicked up. Loki remembered seemingly random things. From the pattern of dust on Chadwick's tactical gear to the number of times he blinked. From the dark night of the second year when the flying car crashed into the Whomping Willow to crimson moonlight on the willow tree right before his reincarnation. His mind was a mess of memories. He felt nostalgic about simply living as his memories of settling into this life floated by while simultaneously feeling distraught at the fact that it had changed him into something completely unrecognizable from before. He felt anger, the small spark of dissatisfaction at his innocence being ruined was amplified and distorted further. An undetermined amount from an undetermined source as the chaos of information in his mind mixed with the flickers of corruption that tried to use his memories as embers to spark fire within his own mind. Which one is it? I'm gonna murder that coward and leave his camping body to rot in the sun so that he can touch grass. Loki complained to himself with seething rage. This whole thing would have been so much easier if I simply stole their abilities. But no, their stupid pathway loses control instantly if I do that. His senses worked overtime to think while combating the raging storm within. But he didn't have to think for very long, the answer was clear. Loki decided almost immediately that the demigod inside the MCCC's office was responsible for manipulating fate. Firstly, because the demigod in front of him was still posing like there was no tomorrow. Secondly, because Loki traced the spirit body threads of the things around him which had had their luck suddenly changed, and instantly felt them all bend in a single direction, towards the inside of the MCCC's office. If he couldn't decrypt things after this, he should have just parasitized a bug and lived its life until it died. However, Loki wasn't given time to breathe, collect himself or even directly retaliate. With a sharp spaz, the world around Loki shattered momentarily. Space itself fell through as Loki found himself staring at the top of his head and the back of his head at the same time while also seeing himself in a mirror that was reflecting his ass. The world seemed to have become a kaleidoscope of reality. It was in this moment where his perception was heavily distorted by the second posing demigod that Loki felt the fate of the world around him rapidly shift. This time, however, instead of seeing their fortune, Loki noticed their clear and assured plunge to death. And so, Loki used the Mentor of Deceit characteristics once again to deceive the Beyonder ability, distorting his senses, and did the next best thing he could do immediately: he flipped it back at his enemy. Loki's world cleared and he was given a short pause as the fate of the world around him started to recover once again, but he didn't allow for it to be manipulated. With his arm outstretched, Loki split off even more worms of time from his body, irrespective of the consequences, and threw them into the room with the help of his Mentor of Deceit characteristics. Loki felt his mental stability decrease rapidly, but it was nothing beyond what he could handle. Instead, he focused on a singular thing. He needed to take out the demigod who'd grazed a Beyonder of the monster pathway as soon as possible. He couldn't let something as silly as luck ruin his carefully thought out plans. Loki's concentration reached its peak as his mind split on maintaining the several worms of time that had split off from his body while also simultaneously keeping an eye on the posing demigod to prevent him from using any crowd control or distortion abilities to ruin the precarious balance he'd set up. But he didn't really have to worry about that since the demigod was currently reeling on the floor, retching and pouring everything into his own orifices while screaming, "Lord!" The worms of time teleported into the room, expanding Loki's senses to give him a complete image of what was inside it. A half-broken man, split right down from the middle vertically, lay in a pool of his blood on the floor, fused with it completely, as his remaining body was slowly being unraveled like a ball or yarn by the demigod right beside it to fund the heavy consumption of flesh and blood that was being used in a fight beyond his understanding or comprehension. The MCCC was alive. And he was horrified. His half-lips moved, barely, as he tried to speak his astonishment and surprise to the voices in his rapidly devolving head, but even that failed after the demigod suddenly pulled a large amount of flesh from the body to form a wall of flesh and blood. The MCCC could only look on with horrific terror as he saw and felt his body split apart, cell by cell, before being reconstructed into a thick cloak around the demigod which blanketed him completely. The MCCC was still alive. His eyes hovering around like loose buttons, dangling from their nerves, spinning on the flesh blanket, looking eerily at everything around they could look at. They soon paused, however, since they met another pair looking directly at them. These ones were a deep crimson red and carried the slightest but sharpest hint of danger. A slit for the mouth opened underneath them as a tongue slipped out and licked them. On the other side of the heavy metal door, he defended. Loki thought, surprised. How did he detect that? Almost in the same instant Loki felt the dip in his fate smoothening, as if it never existed. Coincidence? Loki almost believed, but stopped when he remembered what he'd just seen on the other side. The MCCC was on the floor near the door. Which meant that what produced the thud from hitting the thick metal door at the start of the fight wasn't the demigod being infected by Loki's parasite attack and flinging himself on it, but him throwing the MCCC at it. He grazed a Beander from the abyss pathway. Loki concluded since if the demigod stopped cursing him with misfortune, it could only mean that he'd chosen to use the abilities of another grazed soul, one which could detect danger after he'd enhanced his own luck. Loki's, however, continued with his plan as he remained unconvinced for the need to modify it, and within moments, the worms of time teleported previously to the MCCC's location who he thought to be the demigod, were stolen once again and split apart, with one group sent under the flesh cloak that the demigod wove to protect himself, while the other went directly into the spirit world. Since the other party was a demigod, Loki could damage him, as long as he damaged his physical, mental or spiritual bodies. And since the mental body was left hard to attack since Loki was currently dealing with his own body of heart and mind being in turmoil, Loki chose to directly attack through the spirit world. With his rapidly recovering luck, Loki's plan worked. What was a case of a demigod of the Hanged Man pathway simply using someone from the Abyss pathway to detect danger instantly turned into a nuisance as his radar simply fired off a large amount of warnings that overwhelmed him. Loki had simply designed a million different methods for each worm to kill its target, trapping the man in an endless cycle of prophetic illusions and visions unless he stopped using the grazed soul. But to stop he had to first exit the visions, an endless loop powered by the rate at which Loki was thinking of new ways to kill the demigod. It might not have been enough on its own, but Loki used the Mentor of Deceit characteristics once again to deceive the demigod's sense of danger, making him confused about which of the worms were more dangerous than the others, forcing him to rely on the visions to attack or dodge them. Right at that moment, however, Loki acutely felt his legs sink. Not because he'd lost footing this time, but because the ground suddenly turned into a toxic swamp. Except before he could pull his legs up, Loki felt the world around shift at a drastic pace, moving upwards until he hit what felt like a truckload of poison as his entire body drowned in pain. Something had grabbed a hold of his shins and dragged him under. Within moments, Loki found himself gurgling in a thick sludge-filled toxic lake that constantly corroded his skin and attacked everything they touched. It proved to be a struggle simply to stay alive. His eyes were first after his skin as they began to melt. His teeth and nails were next as they rotted, while small fungi began to sprout from their insides, filling his mouth and throat, choking him as they showed no signs of stopping. They rushed to his head, hoping to amortize his mind. Forced to keep his eyes shut as they continued to melt, Loki stole a bundle of fungi with a swift theft, but since that didn't do anything to stop them or put a dent in their progress, he directly deceived them. Except, in doing so he had to stop his assault on the previous demigod who he was using the Mentor of Deceit characteristics to make the eventual parasitization easier. Amidst this assault, Loki felt an indescribably large sense of danger rushing towards his back. His melting skin curled up with the chills he felt as he ducked low, barely dodging the fast-moving black greatsword that was aimed at chopping his head off. Except, it seemed to have been a feint. The black greatsword that had attacked Loki suddenly exploded. The already close black blades suddenly shattered into tiny fragments, each shooting at Loki with speeds capable of putting any automatic rifle to shame as they reached his already corroding body and put several more holes into it. However, they never went past. Instead, like the fungi and the sludge, they lodged into his wounds and began to fester within them to weaken him faster, attacking his already weak mental body by stirring up the degenerate thoughts in his mind and giving him a hard time to defend himself and know right from wrong. To the degree that as soon as Loki attempted to steal them, he felt that he was wrong and that it was right to be subservient to the all-knowing and all-seeing omniscient Lord that was the true creator. And just as the shards were about to explode and dissolve into his wounds to amplify the degenerate thoughts in his storm of mental instability, Loki reacted. He thieved just enough of them to brave through the mounting pressure of the storm in his mental world, while splitting another worm of time, just one this time, as he raised his near-decayed hand holding his wand towards the Black Knight, the third demigod who had finally revealed himself. Having the third demigod in his sights, Loki could afford to go all out and end this fight with no hesitation. Except even before Loki could launch his spell, the sludge around him suddenly churned. And with no anchorage, his body spun and his aim shifted from its target while a dreamy song echoed in his ears. But it was nothing sort of soothing. Despite the pleasant underlying tune, the hellish vocals made Loki feel like clawing his ears out. The song, however, did not stop and continued to reduce the sanity of its audience. In a fit of madness, Loki jabbed a bony fleshless fist into an exposed wound on his throat and pulled a fist full of fungi festering and growing inside it. He then jabbed the fungi into his ears, only belatedly realizing that he'd just helped them reach his mind. Almost instantly, the fungi grew tenfold, each sprouting its bulb before bursting in a dazzling explosion to send spores towards his brain. Loki thieved hundreds if not thousands of spores, except he couldn't thieve the sea of them that erupted inside his head. The fungi grew so much that Loki felt them poke out of his empty eye sockets and against his hold eyelids. His mind slowed as his body sent hordes of miscalculated signals to every other part of his body, causing it to spasm as Loki did everything in his power to command his arm to finish his spell. A powerful and condensed force of light erupted from the tip of his wand. The spell Loki was using was a simple one. Lumos Maxima. The blinding light flared in power as Loki pulled out a sacrifice from within his pouch while holding out as he launched the first spell he'd used of this kind after Nicholas had taught him about it. The spell was originally modified to be aimed as a beam directly at his target, the demigod, but Loki was forced to abandon the idea now that he was blind, deaf, and losing control of his most basic senses fast. The world lit up for a moment as the sludge around Loki evaporated to a small degree around him. The light had lasted only for a moment before the shadows around completely engulfed it and dragged the whole place into darkness once again. But the damage was done. Loki looked at the pitiful third demigod who was kneeling on the floor and spitting out a mouthful of flesh and blood, and he smelled like cooked meat. Seeing the pause in the fight, Loki gave a cursory glance to his surroundings and once he found no more immediate threats to address, teleported directly into the Saphira castle to heal himself. 50 worms of time lost, Loki sighed as he stole all the leftover Beander characteristics in the real world to quickly reabsorb them so that he could come back to full power for the finale. He left an illusion in his place just to keep watch over his spoils. The demigod looked at Loki, whose figure just flickered for a moment, questioning if he had seen something wrong given the tiring situation, but when he saw Loki open his eyes and appear fully healed, his whole body shook with fright. He healed from damage to the soul so quickly. One had to understand that the swamp that the demigod had created wasn't just an ordinary transfigured pool of poison and or some flesh and blood magic. It was an ability that formed from the combination of two abilities of the sequence 5 Druid of the Planter Pathway, Underground Slink and Poison Hair Incineration. By turning the ground into a swamp and burning his hair inside it, the demigod had created a sludge capable of rendering even the hardest to kill demigods like those of the Prisoner Pathway useless in mere seconds. But Loki had not only tanked the ability with his bare body without so much as flinching during the entire process, he had even proceeded to withstand an ocean songster's siren's song that would have rendered an ordinary demigod in that situation into madness by making them expose at least their mythical creature form. Loki had done all of that while he had been caught off guard by the attack with the help of the item that Grindelwald had given them to keep them hidden from fate. And he had done it without so much as a scratch after he'd brushed off all the damage that the previous attacks had caused him. He appeared to be in pristine condition while the demigod himself had been cooked by the holy light of the sun goddess herself created by Loki through some weird unknown spell. The demigod shivered, but some semblance of sanity remained as he looked in the direction of his two colleagues. That's right, as long as we tire him, Lord Templar will be here at any moment and help finish him so that we can sacrifice his head to our Lord. Wondering how long it'll take for your friends to join in? Loki asked with an amused expression while twirling his bone wand. Huh. The demigod looked back at Loki with some confusion, and it was only then that he realized that the colleagues for whom he had done all this hadn't launched their attack yet. The demigod who had been struggling on the floor earlier after Loki distorted his senses had recovered fully, but he hadn't moved. The blood mist from the first demigod scattered in the air along with the flesh rug that had formed out of it and clung to the walls and the floor had vanished. The demigod looked back at Loki with an expression of shock and horror while Loki just smiled. Oh, you poor thing, do you still not realize? The demigod was too stunned to even say no, so Loki continued as if he were explaining to a baby. You lot are remarkably easy to defeat. Simply steal your ability to graze souls and you lose control over yourself. But too bad for me, I don't want uncontrollable monsters, I need you to be human so that I can turn you into part of a larger democracy. Great, isn't it? Loki said with a smirk. However, when the demigod remained silent he frowned in annoyance and asked, still don't get it? Arg. Fine, let me show you. Loki tried to take a step closer to the demigod, but that seemed to have knocked some sense to him as he rushed towards his steady colleague, causing Loki to bend over and laugh heartily. Ha 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 ha. Seriously? You think that'll save you? Loki asked, dabbing the edge of his eye to wipe his tears as he flicked his wrist. The demigod was on guard against Loki, but when he felt movement on his right, he grew surprised at first before becoming terrified as he looked at his own colleague pulling a black greatsword out of the shadows and placing it on his neck. Loki looked at the demigod with a bemused expression as he spoke. They're all mine now. But how? That's what you want to ask, right? Loki asked softly, his expression delighted like a child ready to share their exploits while he continued. You could have hidden your spirit body threads from me, but do you really think fate's such a fickle thing? You intertwined your fate with mine the moment you attacked me, and the bond only grew stronger the more you tried to kill me and push me closer to death. The first guy died the minute he tried to mess with the fate of the world around me. He left behind too many traces for me to not decrypt the position of his threads. The second guy, your posing friend, bribed me and created a link to me which I exploited by feeding him a few parasites by lodging them into the flesh bullets he kindly absorbed for me. And you, well, you were just too careless. I simply sent one through the swamp. You used the ability to damage the soul, poison hair incineration, right? An ability that lets you burn hair to create poison that can even damage the soul. Well, you know too little about the soul to even qualify as a dark wizard. It's almost like you're using abilities you don't truly understand. Loki found it in himself to joke as if he wasn't just a hair's breadth away from death. The three of you work well together, one for controlling my fate, one for attacking me directly and another for finishing me off with one big move, a perfect mind, spear and a shield, but in the end it was your own undoing that got you killed. I simply deceived your fates into believing that I was a part of your plans and then parasitized you through me. The rest was just a part of the performance. In reality, Loki was actually acting what he felt it would be to be a parasite. Either multiply fast enough to overload the enemy's defenses, or make a distraction and focus on a one-pointed all-out attack. In this case, since his enemies were just demigods, Loki could afford to focus on both at once. He overwhelmed them with the numbers of his worms of time while also taking enough damage to make his enemies believe they'd won just when he pulled out the rug from under them. Loki then looked at the demigod and smiled as he pulled out a monocle of nowhere and slowly placed it on his right eye. Within moments the demigod felt a sudden upheaval of his entire body. His mind felt sluggish to control while his body felt unresponsive, as if he were a passenger in his own vehicle. The last thing he saw was Loki's smiling face as he whispered the words. Theft completed. There was only silence in the hallway for a few minutes as Loki undid the damage that had occurred in the place, cleaning up Chadwick who had remained unharmed throughout, something Loki couldn't understand but swallowed and kept it at the back of his mind after he divined using worms of time in the Saphira castle that it wasn't unnatural. He made the demigod open the door from the inside before entering the MCCC's office, fixing everything in it, making a new MCCC using an illusion, and then kicking the demigod turned marionette out. As the doors closed softly, Loki looked at the sea of slowly pouring in Beyonders from the Hanged Man pathway through his spirit vision. They were all his marionettes. A few were ordinary Beyonders who still hadn't been converted, but Loki truly couldn't spare a few more worms of time to turn them to. Instead he let them be, for now, since they were part of his greater plan. At least that was until he spotted a rather inconspicuous spirit-body thread mixed in the sea of Beyonders. The thread appeared normal, but it was connected to nothing. Loki instantly realized that it was someone or something using psychological invisibility, and it was at a particularly high level since he couldn't see the person even after spotting their spirit-body threads. This is not so good, Loki muttered under his breath. Loki's muscles tensed a little, but he remained calm and collected, turning off his spirit vision before settling into the room while looking at Chadwick with an annoyed expression. "You are quite the annoyance, aren't you?" "Huh, me?" Chadwick asked in a confused tone, pointing at himself, having been completely unaware of what had happened around him for the past few minutes. "Well, whatever, since you're here anyway, you might as well help me out." "Huh?" Chadwick looked confused. "I'm already helping you, weren't we here to be bait?" Loki frowned for some reason, then shook his head lightly as he enjoyed his last few minutes of peace for now. He was just a little worried about everyone on the top floor since they seemed to have vanished elsewhere. Pernell stayed still, for that was all she could do. She'd known that from the second she'd arrived here that she'd returned to her hell. She didn't know how Grindelwald had brought her into the abyss. Even if it was just a recreation of it, the very fact that she could feel the searching gaze of Mother Tree of Desire, constantly scanning the abyss for intruders using the remnant will of the corpse of the primordial demon interspersed into her roots that spread far and wide in this desolate land, it terrified her. She'd survived the last time only because of the strangely named Truncest brass book that happened to be the uniqueness of the Arbiter pathway and could withstand her corruption momentarily to give her enough time to escape or get rid of the corruption if it hadn't intertwined deeply with her. But Grindelwald had brought her back here. And she didn't have anything to protect herself. As such, she could only do the one thing that could keep her safe during this time while she waited quietly for someone else to save her. Think about everything that had happened to lead to this moment. Maybe then she'd find a way to save herself through her infinite wisdom. Speculum mundi. She remembered the words Grindelwald had spoken before he'd gracefully flicked his wand to draw a straight line in the air with thin white mist. It clearly wasn't a rune, but an action to let the mist seep into the world. And the spell itself roughly translated as mirror of the world in modern English. So was this the mirror world? Pernell didn't even think for a second before she ruled such an audacious thought out. Would a true god really allow an outer god's presence to be felt in their domain? How laughable. The abyss was a perfect example of what would happen if one attempted to ever do such a thing. So was this Grindelwald's own domain. But he wasn't even a true god, and when they'd seen him he was clearly a naive Sequence 3. At least he didn't have a divinity as strong as Nicholas and her, so he was definitely weaker than them. So how did he do such a thing? Pernell had only one conclusion. This was the realm of an outer god, or more accurately, Grindelwald had only pretended to perform a spell while in actuality he'd used a Beyonder ability obtained from a ritual contract with an outer god whose domain this was. Was that outer god truly Mother Tree of Desire herself? Pernell knew not, but her infinite wisdom did have a guess now about how she was to break out of this spell. Grindelwald seemed to have been confident about using this spell on them to make them have a taste of death. Those were tall words to be directed at angels who had multitude of ways to escape and prevent death, much less her and Nicholas, who were favored and could even perform rituals to corresponding gods and gain favors through very little sacrifices. So did this place have the ability to counter all those methods of survival to give them a taste of death? Pernell didn't think so. Such a claim was impossible to make unless you were at least a true god yourself. Instead, she had a different idea. The only truly way to kill a strong enough Beyonder was through the tried and tested method of inducing madness in them. And while Pernell could assume that Grindelwald might have meant that he'd turn them mad using the corruption from an outer deity, Pernell couldn't bring herself to agree fully since neither Nicholas nor the other kids had any experiences with any outer deities, and apart from Nicholas none probably even knew about them. So there had to be another way to induce madness that Grindelwald was banking on. And the only other way was self-induced. What if a Beander violated the principles they'd used as guidance to act and digest their potion until now? What if a Beander acted on the side of justice and being good to others while on their path? What if they were suddenly asked to kill everyone in sight and turn them into tortured pincushions? The Beander would most definitely go mad without a doubt. And she felt this applied to the current situation. Prunell had followed the guidance of wisdom, always choosing to be careful regardless of how reckless her actions might have been perceived by others. Even during her first trip to the Abyss, she'd only accepted the invitation after she'd first tracked down the uniqueness of the Justicar pathway and only then stepped in because she didn't know about Mother Tree of Desire yet. And such cautious wisdom had saved her when she'd run into a pinch. And now, in this world she'd been so recklessly thrust into, Prunell knew the solution she needed to save herself. I need to jump out and challenge her. Prunell paused for a second. Her mind shut down and quickly rebooted as she redid her mental gymnastics and arrived at the same solution. That was the most reckless thing she could do in this scenario. Something that went against her entire repository of ancient wisdom and heart. But she didn't act recklessly, instead she chose to act as her wisdom said and quietly stand back in the corner she was standing, but her wisdom kicked in again. If this place is somewhere connected to Grindelwald, will attracting the attention of an outer god inside it cause him to become corrupted too? A dangerous smile formed on Prunell's lips as she quickly stepped out of the shadows. She then walked up to a tree root, gathered a bit of pure holy light in her fists and punched through it with a sharp crack. The effect was instant. Her gaze paused its scanning, before it shifted. However, Prunell frowned. Since the world around her cracked and then drowned in darkness before it returned her into the shadows even before the gaze of the outer deity could land near her. I guess it wouldn't be so easy. He'd have known the risks and taken measures to prevent something drastic from happening. Prunell folded up her sleeves and tied her hair into a tight bun. Time to get to work. I shall show this dastardly kid who is going to give whom a taste of death. She noticed the slight instability in her emotions she felt when she broke her own acting principles, but held it down since she wasn't being reckless, she was only using her wisdom in more modern and clever ways. After all, modern problems require modern solutions. Hermione looked at Daphne with a sigh as the latter exploded into a shower of flesh and blood for the millionth time inside. The scene didn't affect her in the same way anymore. It wasn't like it didn't make her feel sad or terrible. Now it also made her feel exceptionally angry at Grindelwald each time she remembered him. She wished she could grab his head and stuff it into a mortar and pestle to crush it before stuffing it into a blender to make a smoothie out of it and then serve it in front of Mr. Eyre to make him use the highest ability of his pathway to curse the man so that he'd never be able to die and have to live as a bald, ugly, wretched creature doomed to roam the world with no relief from constant torture and increasing pain. She wanted to make his life as terrible as she could. Arg. It's not like I'm the one that's killing Daphne. Why am I even feeling so terrible about all this in the first place? Hermione cursed out loud, her hands gripping her wand with full force as she conjured an illusory Ron and then punched him in the face for no apparent reason. The world dissolved again as she found herself back at the start with maddened Beyonders around her once again. She'd done everything at this point that she could think of. She'd killed every single one of these corrupted Beyonders as fast as she could. She'd tried to ask the other people around her, Loki and Harry who were battling the Death Eaters and Voldemort nearby for help. She'd also let herself be subject to corruption, and allowed herself to be reduced to a maddened state right before the world dissolved in hopes of seeing if it would break the loop. But none of it seemed to have worked. She was still stuck, like she was doomed to repeat the same cycle over and over again. Have I tried everything? Hermione asked herself, trying to squeeze every ounce of creative solution in her mind that she could to try and figure out if there was anything else she could do. She walked around, dodging the attacks around her with a sense of omniscience since she'd lived here long enough to know exactly what happened anywhere at every moment in this strange world. With each step she took, Hermione walked farther and farther away from Daphne, her grip around her wand tightened. She didn't know what to do anymore. Her mind was turning up a blank and her patience was running thin. She'd been here for far too long. Even if the real world was running much slower compared to this place, which she'd guessed since Mr. Eyre hadn't summoned her for another tarot club meeting, she felt like she'd been here for months if not years already. It was weird. This place was like an exact snapshot of the world as she remembered it through her mind's eye. But at the same time it exposed details she had never seen before. Like when she tried talking to Professor McGonagall to see if her version in this place would have a solution for her and found out that Professor McGonagall hoped for her to be her true successor in the mystery prior pathway. Or how her own parents seemed to think a little less of her now that she was focusing on the world of magic more than the Muggle world when they had hoped that she'd grow closer to them after spending so much time apart each year based on how she'd written her letters. Eventually, Hermione stopped and pulled open a door, walking out to be right in front of Daphne again as she looked at her in frustration. "Why am I here?" Hermione asked no one in particular. She saw Daphne look at her blankly like always, but suddenly Hermione took a step back in surprise as Daphne's expression suddenly distorted. Not in pain or resolution of sacrifice like each time it had when she was about to explode, but in a terrible sense of hatred and disgust. Hermione suddenly felt a vaguely terrible premonition linger over her as she wished she could immediately run away. But before she could open another door and slip away, Daphne suddenly spoke in a distorted tone. "You. It was you. Because of you that I died." That was all Hermione heard before the world dissolved and restarted once again. Except this time she felt something within her soundlessly shatter into pieces. Belmont stood in front of his grandfather filled with surprise and shock. "It's true," the old man said, gently taking Belmont's delicate hands into his own. But Belmont didn't pull back, or rather he was too shocked to do so. "The déjà vus I've been having, they're all time loops." The old man nodded. "While I do not know the nature of this place, I'm telling you the truth, Belle." "Oh, how do you know?" Belmont immediately asked, causing the old man to chuckle. "Would you believe me if I said it wasn't me knowing at all?" "Huh?" Belmont asked, confused, his glazed eyes regaining focus as he looked at his grandfather with an intense expression, pressing him to reveal everything he knew. "It was the goddess. The man you saved back then, the one whose name is on that letter," the old man said, pointing at the letter Belmont was holding with his chin before continuing, "Professor Snape. He received a divine message from her Grace. And he asked me to warn you about what was happening and how to get out of here." Belmont immediately grew serious. He couldn't remember everything about his real life. But things were vaguely slipping around in the backdrop of his memories. He could vaguely remember a few things about him being out on an important mission somewhere with someone called Tonks and her juniors from Hogwarts. "You must listen to me carefully," the old man said, tightening his grip on Belmont's hands as he looked directly into the young man's eyes with a much greater intensity than Belmont could ever muster. It caused Belmont to gulp audibly before nodding his head slowly with surety. "You must kill me just like how he killed your Mo," the old man started, causing Belmont to interrupt almost immediately. "Never. I'm not like him and I will never do such a filthy thing." Belmont's eyes had already reddened as he did his best to hold back his tears. He immediately pulled away his hands from his grandfather's grasp as he screamed back. "How could you say such a thing? You can't be real. You're only tricking me into doing something unthinkable." The old man gently shook his head. "Now's not the time for such discussions about plans of deceit. The lives of people the goddess cares about very much is at stake right now, along with much of the rest of humanity." Belmont frowned, his lips quivering in heart-aching pain while his cold hands started to turn even cooler due to fright and surprise. "This is important," the old man reiterated. "It is important that you kill me just like the piece of filth that killed your mother. That's the only way to free yourself from this place and deliver the goddess's message to the person she wishes to speak to." Belmont sniffled lightly, he then rubbed his eyes and slowly firmed his eyes. "Who is it? Who does the message need to be delivered to?" The old man sighed softly before speaking again. "Apparently it's someone you know who is near you." "Who?" Belmont asked again. "Hermione Granger," the old man replied quietly. Dumbledore looked at the papers in his office, spread out everywhere like there wasn't a single thing in the world that could make him rearrange everything. Thud. The wind blew in a little top quickly and slammed the windows shut, sending his carefully arranged papers into the air, ruining hours of hard work where he had been trying to arrange the papers according to their writings into the drawing of a cockroach cluster. It was hard work, believe me, Dumbledore pleaded to no one in particular as he continued munching on a few cockroach clusters he pulled out of his infini desk drawer. He then looked far away into the distance, muttering something only he understood before sighing and closing his eyes. The world before Dumbledore suddenly changed. It shifted from the Hogwarts headmaster's office as he traveled into a vastly empty space filled only with a blinding white light that was reminiscent of a fluorescent light tube light set up in a white room for experiments. He stood silently for a while before quietly kneeling on the floor. It was almost as if he was about to pray, but he didn't. He wasn't the sort of man built for such a thing. Instead, after kneeling on the floor slowly, he put his ear on it, as if he were listening to a secretive conversation on the other side. And then out of nowhere, Dumbledore spoke softly, as if whispering sweet nothings while reminiscing with an old friend. "It's done. The opportunity will be here soon." The space was silent for a while before it changed slowly, breathing lightly as the light pulsed. It seemed to indicate that the light was happy, but one could not truly be sure, and these matters left open for interpretation. But at least Dumbledore thought that the being on the other end was happy, and that's what mattered. The space fell silent again as Dumbledore paused too for a few seconds before he spoke again. "What about the boy?" The light fluctuated slightly as if in irritation before slipping into a rhythmic pulse again, making Dumbledore have to interpret such vague actions as words again. "Leave him to you?" he asked with surprise. The light remained unchanged, causing Dumbledore to sigh softly. "All right, I hope you know what you're doing then. I have finished my part, now I only wish for you to fulfill your end of the bargain." The light remained steadily bright for a short while before pulsing softly as if in agreement. Dumbledore, however, interpreted that as something else since he frowned. "No. Have I missed something?" Dumbledore paused for a few seconds as he suddenly remembered, the location of the Chaos Sea. "Unfortunately I couldn't get that in time. But worry not, the one who knows its location seems to show up wherever the boy goes. Sometimes I wonder if Grindelwald is truly right in his madness about the boy, but I guess he's not since I checked myself. You seem to know a lot more than he does though, which is a little concerning since you want to sacrifice, but, well, I got sidetracked again. Sorry for that. Anyway, you should be able to use the boy to find out where the Chaos Sea is if you are truly who you say you are." The light remained steady and pulsed again, a little faster this time, as if impatient. You need to leave. All right, I shall not hold you any longer then. But please make sure you follow through on your promise. Or I'll be forced to turn to the one you fear, pardon me, the blasphemer, according to you." The light pulsed rapidly and forcefully again as if in anger, but Dumbledore had vanished long ago. Ron looked at the tarantula beside him and sighed. He had lost count of how long he'd been trapped in this world with his little spider friend to accompany him. At one point in between he'd had some pity for his new friend. But at this point, after so many loops that went nowhere, he was starting to seriously hate it, regardless of if the spider was not even responsible for all of it in the first place. All he knew was that killing it reset the world in every way. He poked and prodded it as a sharp gleam appeared in his eyes. Out of all the possibilities he'd already tried, there was one he'd always ignored, or rather hoped not to try out, since it disgusted him. Disgusted him more than having to eat the spider alive. But this was the only one left in his magnificent brute force tactic. After enacting his grandest strategy of brute forcing through the puzzle, this was truly the only way forward remaining that he hadn't tried. And so he began. "Let's go, buddy," Ron said softly, pulling up the tarantula, grabbing it by its abdomen and placing it on his shoulder as they smoothly walked down the stairs, mocking Fred and George, who had been waiting outside to hear him scream on their way down, to arrive at the Weasley garage. "I wonder where that Muggle moving picture thing went. Dad said it was in the garage last time, but I never found it." Ron looked through the collection of items in the garage, ranging from simple light bulbs to miniature Christmas trees made out of Muggle plugs. He didn't know what much of it was, or even did, but he did remember his dad showing everyone a movie from the Muggle world when they were younger on something called a projector. How do you select what you want to watch on this thing?" Ron mumbled to himself while placing the patiently waiting tarantula on the side arm of the couch and giving it a few garden worms to snack on. After fumbling with it for a bit, something did start playing on the dirty wall of the garage, but since it was dark in the garage and the film itself was very old, it didn't affect the viewing experience very much. As such, one spider and one human child began to watch a cult classic, The Jungle Book. The story progressed smoothly with both Ron and the little peer intrigued by the world of equal friendship between man and animal projected in the images on the wall. They shared a bucket of popcorn, courtesy Mrs. Weasley, who gave him one after seeing him sit quietly so early in the morning after he'd finished making his bed without being told to. She did find the tarantula a bit concerning, but after Ron tattled that Fred had turned his teddy bear into this, Molly rushed off to teach the twins a lesson, leaving Ron behind to have fun with his new little pet. They watched the movie in silence, even laughing at times when they found something rather peculiar or funny and when the main character, a man's cub, and the other animals bonded with each other. It even seemed to make the spider itself think of Ron as the main character from the movie. Someone reliable and someone that could be trusted since he was feeding it even though it was born for the sole purpose of scaring him. Eventually, Ron got up for a moment, leaving the spider behind as he brought back a glass of water for himself and another smaller bowl for the spider after they finished eating the popcorn. And when Ron handed over the bowl to the spider, it even realistically nodded in appreciation towards him, which caused him to feel a little guilty about what was going to happen next. But guilt was something he was used to by now. Except, why does this feel so much like being a damn snake? I feel like this is something Malfoy would do. Ron had simply mixed a little bit of pest-eradicating potion into the water. The spider drank a few drops without even looking at its contents because it trusted Ron so much, and sure enough, before its third sip its legs suddenly scrunched up as it turned backwards and collapsed. Ron saw his own reflection in the spider's now hollow empty eyes and felt terrible as the movie continued to play with him alone. He waited for the world to reset so that he could apologize to the spider irrespective of if it remembered such things or not. But not this time. The world remained the same. And instead of turning black, it suddenly shattered, leaving Ron standing back in the same corridor he was in before. Single quote. Ron looked around and even though the corridor was empty right now felt a tear slip out of his eyes, but he quickly wiped it up. Except the corridor wasn't empty for very long since Ron wasn't the only one who had broken the spell. Almost as soon as he arrived, the space around him shattered multiple times, each shatter bringing someone else along with it back into the real world. First was Nicholas, who looked to be reeling something inside him that was quickly getting out of control. Hermione was next. She arrived looking distraught and soulless. She checked her hands constantly as if there was blood on them. She appeared to be horrified enough that her hands shook and trembled constantly even though they were as clean, plain and soft as ever. Belmont was last. He arrived with wide eyes. As if he'd seen something that had traumatized him. But before anyone else could arrive or anything else could happen, Belmont sprinted towards Hermione and grabbed her shoulders. "I have an important..." Before he could complete speaking, however, Ron stepped in and grabbed Belmont's hands and stopped him from speaking. And instead of turning to Belmont to explain his actions, he turned to Hermione and spoke softly, "You too." Nicholas on the side picked up on the conversation and also on Belmont's thoughts, learning the gravity of the message as he spoke quickly while pausing Ron's heartfelt question. "Now's not the time. We've all done something we're truly disappointed with and that makes us feel like we want to die or be dead, but our priority right now is to move ahead." Ron wanted to say something, but Hermione placed her hand on his shoulder and sighed. Her eyes turned firm as she spoke while looking into Nicholas's eyes resolutely. "What should I do, Mr. Flammel?" Grindelwald looked around with glee. His fingers tapping his sides in a rhythmic tone as he walked with light steps along the horde of Aurora Order members, each marching towards the same place. The MCCC's office. With the same purpose. To offer someone special to the true creator. As if relishing in the gentle refreshing breeze of an early victory heightened by his mood, he took in a deep breath with his eyes closed. As the cold dry air seeped into his lungs, he allowed the calming chill to seep into every bone before he exhaled with a bright smile and a glimmer in his eyes. "Who would have thought?" Grindelwald whispered into the wind. He still remembered the day he'd been forced to split his soul. Oh, the shame, the absolute shame he'd felt that day. Grindelwald could still feel the burning rage hidden or rather forcefully contained within his chest as he looked through the door at Loki. "You took a part of me, oh great Mr. Error, this time I'll return the favor. I'll make sure you remember just how it feels to have your entire plans ruined at their epitome." Loki's totally normal spirit body, tinged with a slightly crimson tint to represent his nervousness or fear, felt natural to Grindelwald. He relished in it as if Mr. Error himself was worried and about to be struck by misfortune. Grindelwald then looked at the Aurora Order members around him. He observed their spirit body threads that all seemed to be deeply involved with hatred for Loki, waiting eagerly to execute the orders of their lord, and then thought back to the moment long ago when he'd been forced to admit defeat in front of him. A frown marred Grindelwald's otherwise handsome features as he thought about it, and then repeated a vow he'd made several times to himself. Even if he is no longer here, I'll find every last hope he can have of ever coming back, and then I'll make sure it vanishes right before his eyes each time he tries. Everything's already going according to plan. Now I just need to make sure that the Daughter of Wisdom applies her wisdom at the right moment so that I can drag this brat into her domain and make him beg me to save him. Then I can plant the right trap for Mr. Error when he descends into the boy under the pretext of saving these misguided sheep to prevent the calamitous descent of an outer god. Ah, perfection. With his eyes closed, Grindelwald thought back to the vision he'd had not too long ago. One that had given him the confidence to pull off such a wild and risky plan. The Daughter of Fate. Grindelwald opened his eyes, and under the cover of psychological invisibility he pulled open the historical void and attempted to bring out something that was once in his close proximity. Except, it failed. Again. A sense of worry started to flicker in Grindelwald's heart as the cornerstone of his plan seemed to be betraying him at the last second, but he calmed down soon after. His divination couldn't be wrong. That he was sure of, since he'd already taken several precautions to make sure that they couldn't be interfered with, since he'd divined about it all in the presence of Cheek inside the mirror dimension, her domain, something she had total control over. So unless she'd betrayed him herself, such a thing would never happen. And Cheek would never betray him, since Mr. Error was her sworn enemy. She was someone who hated the great Mr. Error even more than he did, for some reason lost to time, and so he trusted her hatred, her eagerness to rip him to shreds if he was standing right in front of her. To top it, Grindelwald had avoided polluting his fate with any thoughts about direct action against the boy. Instead, he'd relegated Loki's location to another sworn enemy who seemed rather interested in getting rid of Loki for good. Grindelwald trusted the saying, "An enemy's enemy is my friend," very much. At least in Mr. Error's case, since there was hardly a single normal person he hadn't offended in history. With how prudish he'd always been, it wasn't hard to make grand plans to fulfill his long-standing dream of holding his life hostage. History had always been written according to his whims and fancies. Victory and defeat decided by it. And when he'd attempted to interfere with it, he was struck down. Pressed under his thumb, made to bow, made to split his soul, made to suffer for an eternity. But no more. No one would pull on his strings of fate any longer. Angel of History. Grindelwald recalled his once famous title that had now been merged into the darkness, lost to the common populace, all because of one Mr. Error. Too bad I couldn't be present at your death. Grindelwald clicked his tongue in annoyance, but then smiled once again. But I'll make sure you feel just what I felt through your vessel during your rebirth. Grindelwald's eyes focused as he finished thinking about his plans and machinations, as he planned to regain his title once again and make the world tremble in fear of it. He couldn't be wrong, he reassured himself. After all, he was an angel himself. He had taken help from the Angel of Imagination. He had two true gods on his side, both of whom wanted to rip Loki's guts out for whatever reason, and he was making use of an outer god. How could a mere demigod even tickle him at this stage? He'd be surprised if Loki even recognized him with how smooth things were going so far. But that was a given with how long this plan was in the making. How many centuries have passed again? Yet, he felt his hand tremble slightly. For the Lord, someone suddenly chanted from within the group of already maddened and frenzied Aurora Order Beyonders, causing the floodgates to be opened as everyone raised their hands and joined in as the chorus. Down with the heretic. For the Lord. A smile graced Grindelwald's face. Of course he couldn't be wrong. Look at all these fanatics who were willing to sacrifice themselves. Worst came to pass, he could just let them handle the fallout while he made an escape with the true gods once things truly turned horrible. Pernell looked at the giant roots of the tree in front of her spread all throughout the abyss. By now she'd done nearly everything she could think of to attract her attention. But she was just not fast enough. Each time she'd attract her attention, this world would reset itself. Was it to prevent Grindelwald from getting corrupted? Purnell didn't think so. If such a simple act could let Grindelwald become corrupted, he wouldn't even have let her gaze linger around in this place he'd constructed at all. No, it seemed to be intentional. It seemed as if Grindelwald was watching her and knew exactly how she planned on corrupting him using her, and made sure to pull the plug at the absolute last moment so that she would always fail to put him in harm's way. Purnell looked around herself once more. Is there truly no way to cheat the system? With her hands on her hips, Purnell began to slowly unwind the knowledge she'd gathered from her previous attempts, turning them into wisdom for her to reweight the web of memories in her mind. Are there truly no errors in this plan of Grindelwald's? Purnell frowned at the thought. Could such a thing really be possible? It made her think of all the times Nicholas praised Loki's designs of being so error-free. Could Grindelwald be someone like him? But Purnell knew better. Her wisdom knew best that even if Loki's designs weren't error-free, he himself wasn't. In fact, the young boy was a giant bundle of them. He could fool the staff at Hogwarts into believing that he was of the mystery prior pathway while having nothing to show for it. He was a young boy supposed to be from the sleepless pathway, yet he acted completely unlike them since he practically loved sleeping unless he was extremely focused on some project of his. To top it all off, Purnell had also noticed, as did Nicholas, that Loki was favored by fate. Things often seemed to go his way in the end, yet the boy wasn't from the monster pathway or even a devout believer in the goddess of fate. If anything, Loki found any mention of her slightly annoying, reacting with the same expression of someone being shown marriage prospects, and forced to choose one by their parents. Those were still only matters regarding the Beander world. In the humanist world, where Loki often portrayed himself cold and aloof, as if a person without a shred of care in his heart for anyone else, he was surprisingly soft. Even going so far as asking them to try and reconcile with Fleur when she'd been abandoned by her goddess at the end of last year regardless of whether it put his standing with them in a terrible position or not. And that was not including the times Purnell had noticed Loki staring at the two-way mirror always in his pockets during the night. At first she believed it was something to do with young love. But she was indeed terribly surprised to learn that Loki had a younger sister. Someone Loki had never shared anything about with her or anyone else, regardless of how close they were. For a while Purnell even assumed Loki had a daughter in secret, which was why he never spoke about her to anyone else. But after repeated divinations told her that she was wrong, she finally gave up and accepted that Loki had a little younger sister. Granted, she'd never brought it up herself with Loki in hopes that he would bring it up first, but Purnell was slowly running out of patience. She sighed with affection as she remembered the glimpse that she'd caught of Loki's sister in her divination. She and Nicholas had never had a child to avoid having to part with them one day because of how dangerous the Beander world was. But it had left them yearning to form deeper connections with the little ones. It was also partly why they had kept their summer camp running for as long as they had, since it allowed them to constantly see the little balls of joy and relive their simpler youth through them. It kept them sane emotionally. Plus it was a part of the ritualistic magic of every modern Beander that they received as a blessing from the true god of their pathway to help them keep their sanity, since a Beander would go mad after they touched sequence 4 without that. Simply being a part of daily life with a large number of children was enough to maintain their sanity. Spending time with adults to retain your sanity was also possible, but it required a much deeper sense of involvement that was usually impossible for most Beyonders without being seen as an evil dark wizard cult by the Ministry. It was why schools like Hogwarts were a popular spot for several Sequence 4 Beyonders that were not from the Sacred 28, who usually simply traded in their long life spans for their sanity. Any Sequence 4 favored by their true god and taught the ritualistic magic to stay sane through emotional connections could teach magic to little kids and maintain their sanity while doing so. And so Purnell convinced herself. She had to meet Loki's little copy to maintain her sanity. She opened her eyes with a zealous glare that made her look like a grandma holding a plate of cookies for her underfed grandchildren, to the extent that it had probably just made the roots in front of her flinch for a second. Being sufficiently motivated, Purnell activated her final trump card. Something she'd prepared for the slightest chance of being in a confrontation with Mother Tree of Desire once again. And while this wasn't enough to hurt her in any way, however minor, it was enough to trap her in place, for a few seconds or up to a minute. It was valuable time she could use to escape. But right now she wanted to use this trap tool to corrupt Grindelwald instead. It wasn't a plan that would succeed totally if Grindelwald caught onto what she was about to do too quickly, but she hoped she could have help from Nicholas, who was probably already out of his trial, to help push Grindelwald into this prison of her making. From within her undetectable extension charm pouch, Prunell pulled out a simple card. It was a card of blasphemy. For the White Tower pathway. Or at least it looked like the one Prunell had been shown by her true goddess when she'd asked her for guidance on ways to fight off Mother Tree of Desire if she happened to ever cross paths with her again. The card had a trap prepared specially by her, as Prunell was promised that no matter who she used this card against, whether an angel or a true god themselves, it would give her exactly a minute to run away from there. And if it was the Mother Tree of Desire instead, the trap would hold on for a few seconds, provided she was not extremely angry at her. All of this only possible because the bait the card contained was a corrupted vestige of Mother Goddess of Depravity herself. Stolen from a severed part of her body during the last great war between the true gods and the outer gods at the start of the fourth epic. The card looked like a simple thin playing card normally, that had a tower whose top was on fire, like a torch, burning to light the way for the future, except the light was crimson and the tower was covered in thick tree roots and dead vines. Prunell looked at it with a slightly uncertain expression, as if wondering if she should use the card so openly. The thought struck her. Loki. I came to help him. Now I'm stuck and I have to save myself. HMPF. If I don't get that brat who sold out to the blacks to compensate after all this is over, I'll beat him up. Far off in the cosmos. An authoritatively powerful woman with a deceivingly gentle impression merged with a tree upon whom countless bloodied roses bloomed, frowned in annoyance and mild frustration. Who's repeatedly trying to get my attention? Why can't I get their location beyond the fact that they seem to be inside that accursed planet? Has he revived once again? No, not so soon. She said she's already planned a gift for his rebirth. Maybe she got too busy dealing with the Orthodox deities while attacking the barrier right now. The blonde woman chuckled at her own joke, which put her in a slightly better mood as she looked back down at the foolish god she'd been trying to corrupt for the last few centuries, a gift she'd planted at the end of the war of what was called the Fourth Epic. A part of her will was encased within the chained god so that she could take over the planet from the inside. She'd already done this once before through the abyss, but he had sacrificed death to entomb her in its domain so that neither she nor anyone could ever leave or enter the place once again. And so she now planned on making another seedling sprout at the right moment so that she could take back what was rightfully hers from within. But she was starting to get seriously annoyed by this other sudden intrusion of her focus. It wasn't the intrusion itself that was annoying her. She could ignore someone trying something out once or twice and then coming to their senses before dropping the matter altogether. But within moments the small sense of constant need for her attention started to spiral into repeated bangs. As if someone was throwing a stone at her head from across the universe to gain her attention, then pulling back the stone when she looked only to throw it back once again when she stopped looking. It was frustrating to say the least. She was about to ignore it again with anger flaring as she did when on Father's sleep. If I ever get the opportunity to. Chills suddenly ran up her spine as she realized she felt something familiar from the direction of this thing, repeatedly taking up her focus. A card of blasphemy. And then she frowned. Not because she'd figured out that it was a fake or that there was even a trap within it. But the fact that the style of the trap was something she'd seen before caused her to feel disgust and anger. Suddenly, however, a smirk showed up on her otherwise delicate face. A person related to him is trying to invite me to a banquet. Let's hope they've prepared an adequate menu then. Loki looked at Chadwick and spoke softly. So will you do it or not? Chadwick gulped softly, looked at the MCCC who had already suited up fully, indicating he was on Loki's side with the plan, and then nodded with firm eyes. All right, I'll do it. But if I do, don't worry, I'll make sure to be on time. Loki finished. With that said, Chadwick took the lead to cover the office door along with the MCCC who was behind his desk, pointing a simple M9 while keeping an eye on the thick metallic doors that contained the control room which held the launch codes and panel. Chadwick looked at the MCCC and then sighed lightly as he spoke while looking at Loki. He's pretty calm for his age, isn't he? I remember I was shivering in my boots back in the day under my MCT when he chucked us into an infiltration sim. The MCCC turned to look at Chadwick but then frowned slightly as if trying to remember something strange. But weren't you promoted to a sergeant here because of your work in the Soviet? Chadwick looked back at the MCCC and then appeared confused for a second too. Huh. There wasn't time to react to it however since a sudden shout seeped in from the corridor outside. Down with the heretic. For the Lord, comma. Loki looked at Chadwick with a rather strange expression as he suddenly realized something after he'd made his illusion of the MCCC respond to his banter, something that had been bugging him until now. Marionettes didn't give Loki all their memories at once if he didn't explore their body of heart and minds, but they did send him back memories as long as they encountered someone or something familiar directly. It wasn't perfect recall, but at least better than simple memory fragments that he could skim off the top of their mind without a deep dive. Except, now that I think about it, why haven't I seen Chadwick in the memories of any of the Marionette Aurora Order members? Has he never been seen by them? Loki's frown deepened. He didn't think so. Chadwick was part of the patrol team and as such, apart from his own team members most other officers at the launch facility should have at least known his face and name if not known him personally. But Chadwick was invisible. He had never turned up in the memories of any of the Aurora Order members even though he'd been recognized by the various other officers at this facility. Loki couldn't even blame it on the fact that the Aurora Order members hadn't had the opportunity to see Chadwick since they had arrived too late or that they were on different floors. Even though all the Aurora Order members had been portkeyed into the place with the help of the single Muggle wizard relations handler who had unknowingly become a host for one of them carrying the portkey, they'd all had traveled inside the facility while hidden inside the shadows of the various patrol teams, jumping out and turning others into their hosts when they arrived deep enough. Loki immediately checked Chadwick's spirit body thread to see if he was part of an elaborate trap, but it was completely normal. The man wasn't being controlled by anyone else and neither was he being unknowingly directed through ritualistic means. The Quill of Alzuhud? Loki questioned, thinking about Megos becoming the mother of the spawn of the descent vessel of the true creator through contrived coincidences. But could the Quill of Alzuhud hide things from the spirit body threads too? Loki was a little confused. Firstly, he was still a sequence 4 that could be manipulated by the Quill of Alzuhud itself. Secondly, the Quill of Alzuhud was the uniqueness of the visionary pathway, which meant that it could very well fool him into believing things that did not exist. After all, he still hadn't killed off Gehrman Sparrow and its influence on him was undeniable. Then there was the fact that the demigods from earlier hadn't seriously bothered killing Chadwick previously. While it could be attributed to the fact that Chadwick wasn't their target, could a normal person truly survive while standing amidst a full-fledged battle of demigods? Loki felt that he was overlooking something. While he had indeed helped Chadwick not die, Chadwick shouldn't have been unharmed, right? Loki's head rang alarm bells as his counterparts in the Saphira Castle conducted an urgent divination. Chadwick is dangerous to me. They repeated the statement or a variation of it 7 times to cast a broader net over the spirit world before slipping into a state of trance. The results were immediate. All pendulums spun counterclockwise. All except one. Loki frowned. Loki focused his thoughts back to what the singular worm of time which had gained a positive answer had asked and became dumbfounded. Chadwick is part of a grand plan orchestrated by the Quill of Alzuhud to put Gehrman Sparrow in harm's way. Loki repeated the statement 7 times more, trying to let it sink into his subconscious to digest what he was seeing, but before he could even fully digest the fact that he'd overlooked something seemingly important about the situation at hand, he heard a loud shout created by one of his own worms of time that was working on a schedule he'd set earlier to carry out his plan. Down with the heretic. For the Lord. In spite of the shout, Loki kept his eyes on Chadwick. I knew Dumbledore was trying to hurt Gehrman Sparrow, but involving an angel and a true god. Suddenly Loki paused. No, that can't be true, can it? Would someone involve a true god and an angel for the sole purpose of torturing a demigod? Since when did I get that arrogant to think so highly of myself? Loki's frown deepened as he replaced himself with an illusion and stepped into the Saphira Castle to perform a dream divination. The true objective behind the reason for the conspiracy involving me, Gehrman Sparrow, Grindelwald, Dumbledore and the true creator. Loki's vision shifted as he closed his eyes and sunk into a peaceful slumber, landing on a rather simple scene, one that he'd seen before. Dumbledore appeared angry in the scene as he scribbled down the latest prophecy regarding Gehrman Sparrow obtaining the sequence 3 Beander characteristics with the help of a true god. The vision continued until the end, showing in detail how Dumbledore fanatically scribbled down the prophecy as if he was truly angry with Gehrman Sparrow and was burning their bridges. But it shattered soon after. Single quote. How is that the reason? The Quill of Alzuhad caused so many high-level people to cooperate with each other to trap a single demigod. That can't have been the case, could it? While the true creator might be mad and not have the sanity to reject its control, or if he even accepted it simply because I killed one of his demigods, what about Grindelwald? Did the Quill control him then? Loki shook his head almost immediately. While he couldn't be 100% sure about it, Grindelwald almost certainly was keeping a million secrets from Dumbledore about the Fool Pathway since no one else seemed to know about it. And that would mean that while Dumbledore didn't even know who Grindelwald was, Grindelwald himself knew almost everything there was to know about Dumbledore, especially if he was from a previous epoch and had already lived as Herpo the Foul and rose to the status of an angel in the Fool Pathway before Merlin met and studied under the Founders. So the only other option was that Grindelwald had let the Quill control him. For what purpose? Me. I'm so valuable. Loki shook his head again. That can't be the case. While I might be the only error pathway Beander, a demigod can't be so important to Grindelwald. Especially enough to bring out a true god to torment me. He clearly wants to do something else, and is likely using the help of the true creator to cover his plans in some way so that he can lean on Dumbledore's Quill to fake his reasoning. So the divination failed. Loki questioned himself, slightly unsure. Does Grindelwald know that I'm the vessel that Mr. Error will be reborn in? How? Loki asked himself, since this information was supposed to be hidden and limited to the Founders alone from what he'd learnt from their books and diaries in the Room of Requirements. Divination shouldn't have been as effective even if Grindelwald was a true god, since Salazar has authority over concealment. Single quote. Did one of the Founders betray me? Loki couldn't believe it. With how much they'd written about Mr. Error in their books, Loki knew that they couldn't, that doing so would be so abhorrent to them that if any of the other three knew of this indiscretion they'd probably march the betrayer to their bonfire. But I'm not Mr. Error, yet. So wouldn't Mr. Error know about this when he went to the past to correct this mistake anyway? Loki thought to himself as he remembered Rowena's proposal from a couple of months ago. Does Grindelwald have something to do with Mother Tree of Desire then? Did Rowena sell me out so that she could save the chained god while she and Grindelwald worked together to kill me? Single quote. Loki conjured his illusory topaz pendulum and performed a quick divination. Mother Tree of Desire is involved in the current threat to my life. Loki repeated the statement 7 times with his eyes closed. He opened them slowly, but he didn't even need to look at the pendulum to know which direction it was spinning or by how much, since his whole hand was shaking as the pendulum swung clockwise wildly. Loki's pupils shrank down to pinpricks as he looked straight at what was happening. A strange metallic tinge filled his mouth as he bit his cheek too hard in part disappointment and part anger. He closed his eyes, took a few deep breaths and then calmed down before performing a new divination. Rowena gave information about Mr. Error resurrecting using me as his vessel to Grindelwald. He repeated the statement 7 times and opened his eyes slowly. The pendulum was still spinning clockwise, just not as wildly as before. In fact, it was only a mild spin that seemed to indicate that Grindelwald had gleaned the information rather than be told about it directly. Single quote. So it was to be decided if Rowena had been directly involved in this or not. Regardless of what the case was and what her reasoning was, Loki knew better than to try and fight against her right now. He already had a true god, an angel, a quill that could control his fate, and apparently also an outer god waiting for him. Picking a fight with someone who was still in his camp, at least on the surface, would do no good. But I won't let this go, Loki concluded before returning to the MCCC's office. Except, instead of returning to a peaceful office that was about to be broken into by the marionettes that Loki had created, the world staggered. Loki's head flicked sharply towards the top floors of the launch facility. He hadn't realized it earlier because he was inside the Saphira castle, but everyone who had vanished earlier had returned, including the saint from the Aurora Order. Nicholas and everyone else seemed to have entered a short confrontation with him, in which he was already being beaten by a rather ruthless Nicholas, but then they'd paused since Pernell had also returned and something was wrong with her. Loki's eyes landed on Pernell with a strange look. Her body was rapidly deteriorating, fighting a foreign energy that kept trying to corrupt it from within. He'd recognized the energy without delay since he'd come in close contact with someone that embodied a lot of it some time before. It was from her mother tree of desire. Except even as Loki stole it with nothing but a gaze, it didn't stop the deterioration or slow down the energy from pouring in. It seemed like he wasn't going to be able to directly help Pernell in any way since the energy was only located inside her spirit body, but it was pouring in from an entirely different dimension. Loki cycled his sights through the spirit world, the astral world, and even Pernell's currently weakly guarded body of heart and mind, but he couldn't find the corruption's source, and paused for a moment before realizing what was happening. A corruption directly from the cosmos. No, that isn't possible. From the historical void, Loki asked as he thought about Grindelwald. With the source known, Loki was about to shut it off using his mentor of deceit Beander characteristic, except before he could do so, the world in his view split. Loki saw the error pathway symbol radiate out of Pernell's soul before it exploded. Shattered into 1,000 fragments which shattered into 1,000,000 more as they embedded themselves into the very fabric of space around them. Loki's brain worked overtime as the world slowed down. Error pathway. She used some sort of trap Mr. Error or the founders gave her. But a trap for an outer god. What could it even do? More so a trap for Mother Tree of Desire, someone who's so close to her Sephiroth in the abyss. Loki's mind sorted through all the different ways someone from the error pathway could hurt an outer god and came to a single conclusion. Errors. For a being who holds dominion over reason and rationality, to chain their domain of desires, irrationality would be a bane. Hence even the simplest of errors in rationality, at well-placed structures if unexpected, would easily lead to her failing to control her own symbols and being consumed by them instead. Loki's thoughts didn't need time to be evaluated since the exploded fragments almost instantly started to latch onto the corrupt energy that was pouring into Pernell from the historical void before merging into them completely and seamlessly, as if they'd never existed before, becoming a Trojan horse. However, it seemed that not everyone was satisfied by this outcome. Loki's eyes flickered back towards Grindelwald, whose spirituality suddenly spiked. What was before a spirit-body thread that led to no one was now connected to a man powerful enough to make Loki feel like an ant. If Nicholas and Pernell's spirituality was as vast as an ocean, Grindelwald's was as vast as the solar system. It was as if a curtain had suddenly lifted from his body, leaving what was hidden behind in plainly view. Even then, however, Loki could keenly feel that an even bigger and larger store of something was being held back. Loki didn't know what it was that was being hidden from his sight so stringently, but he didn't have the time to explore. Almost as soon as Loki saw Grindelwald reveal himself, Grindelwald lifted his hands, outstretched them towards Pernell as a simple card appeared in his left hand. A card of blasphemy, Loki realized. The Fool card, to be precise. Single quote exclamation mark single quote. How does he have that? He then made the motion of dragging something out of the card and throwing it at the error pathway symbol shining brightly within Pernell. It didn't take a moment for whatever Grindelwald had done to take effect, as Loki immediately realized what had happened by studying the runes in the ability Grindelwald had just used. He grafted the domain of foolishness from the blasphemy card onto the trap. Loki didn't know how a card of blasphemy could produce a true domain, something that only a uniqueness could contain, but Grindelwald had performed something akin to a miracle. The error pathway symbol within Pernell mutated, sprouting the symbol of Fool pathway onto it as if it had suddenly been fooled into forgetting its own form. And its effect was instantaneous. The error pathway fragments that had been almost impulsively merging with the spiritual corruption pouring out of the historical void into Pernell started to slow down. However, things didn't just end there. The corrupt spiritual energy within Pernell suddenly surged violently as if it had been waiting for exactly this moment. In the moment laid bare before Loki's eyes, the corrupt spiritual energy had temporarily accommodated the error fragments within itself by using the very errors they used to disguise themselves in the corruption and flipping their rationality to truly believe that they were part of the whole. Mother Tree of Desire had suddenly gained a temporary hold over the air domain, for a few moments. And before anyone could figure out what had happened, the world shifted. Loki's senses tingled dangerously as he extended his own hands to steal the thoughts of the corrupt energy trying to ravage Perenelle to prevent it from acting on its next thoughts, but the Full Pathways symbol suddenly grew brighter at this key moment. Loki felt his mind turn sluggish for a second as the world sped up around him. The simple link that had connected between him and the error symbol had somehow been exploited as Loki found himself losing his mental capacities. And in the blink of an eye he was transported to the abyss. Except, Loki's backup kicked in and theft successful, Grindelwald looked around himself. The Aurora Order fanatics were all here, surrounding a small group of rather wary-looking individuals. Nicholas Flamel, Perenelle Flamel, Hermione Granger, Ron Weasley, a Metamorphagus, a vampire and above all, Loki, the boy whom he hoped to see begging for his life, correction, the lives of everyone in front of him, today. Things had proceeded smoothly so far. Perenelle's trap had been a little more aggressive than he'd remembered it being from the fourth epic when Mr. Error had used it, but it seemed like Mother Tree of Desire had adapted to it as well and learnt from her previous experience. So simply causing a small amount of confusion within the temporary worms of time created and released by the symbol itself was enough to let her manipulate them and affect their rationality to make them do things they would have otherwise not attempted. For example, bringing all those that they wished to save into the abyss. A place that no one could go in or out of very easily. A domain belonging thoroughly to her. In fact, Grindelwald could feel her presence right above them. Gazing at them through the cosmos, using the corrupted body of the primordial demon inside the abyss to keep them in her sights. What do you think about it? Grindelwald asked softly. He knew exactly why she was still waiting and not acting to immediately kill them inside her domain, so he trusted his fate as he turned to look at Loki, who had regained his earlier lost rationality. Loki stayed silent. His eyes wandered around the area before landing on Grindelwald's now occupied hands. In it was a simple stuffed cloth doll. It had buttoned eyes, a green skirt, and luscious golden blonde hair. It was a doll of a pretty cute little girl. Grindelwald noticed Loki's gaze and smiled. "Oh, so you've seen my trump card already," Grindelwald said with a mischievous undertone. He pointed at the doll in his hands and was about to say something, but Ron mumbled loud enough for everyone to hear, "Isn't he a little too old to be playing with dolls meant for little girls?" Grindelwald's open mouth remained hanging. He was about to forego the interruption and continue speaking, but Hermione interrupted. "Dolls aren't only for girls, Ron. Even boys can play with them." Ron showed a slight frown of disgust before frowning at his own thoughts and pausing as he remembered the times he'd played with Ginny when he was bored. He remembered having quite a bit of fun with them actually. "Why am I even thinking about this? Single quote. But suddenly when he saw Hermione's smug, winning smirk, he felt like he'd swallowed a sour punch regardless of their current situation. He'd lost twice. Hermione had made him think good about dolls. And she'd forced a thought into him, a spectator, using legilimency. Grindelwald ignored everyone and continued speaking, assuming that their intelligence had been affected by merely being in the presence of the Full Pathway symbol. But he was interrupted once again, this time by Tonks. "Girls aren't dolls," Tonks said with an annoyed expression as she pinched Ron, who screamed wordlessly, "I know. I wasn't thinking that." Tonks looked in between Hermione and Ron suspiciously before sticking her tongue out slightly. I thought." Hermione looked at Tonks in confusion before her eyes suddenly went round and wide as her cheeks turned a deep shade of crimson. "Tonks." Hermione punched Tonks' shoulder with a dull thud indicating just how much force was behind it. Hey, Tonks laughed, taking the punch lightly as she pat Hermione's head with a smile. Loki didn't understand what was happening. But he'd just read Nicholas's mind and acted accordingly. He stole all their voices and looked back at Grindelwald. Shocked about having lost their voices so suddenly, they looked at Loki with surprise. Hermione more than anyone else, since she recognized the spell that Loki had just used. "You may continue. Oh, you don't need my permission, but you may," Loki said snarkily, causing Grindelwald to frown. His fingers twitched as Loki wondered if he was going to try turning them into marionettes, but that didn't happen. Instead, Grindelwald spoke with a domineering presence that felt suffocating for those not at least demigods. Haven't you wondered why she hasn't attacked us yet? Grindelwald asked, his finger pointing at the dark sky of the abyss. Hermione, Ron, Tonks and Belmont all looked straight above, but they didn't spot a thing. Loki, Nicholas, and Perenelle kept their eyes on Grindelwald since they'd already known that Mother Tree of Desire was above them. Her gaze a stringent lock on their positions as it traced their every move. But for some reason, she had not attacked yet. Only Loki felt he sort of understood what was happening. He looked back at the doll that looked a little familiar to him. And while its face looked familiar too, that wasn't what he was talking about. It was the sort of familiarity Loki felt from his spirituality. However, Loki didn't risk turning on his spirit vision again to confirm. Not in this place where doing so would mean instant death. And if he was right, apart from the lady hanging over the abyss, the doll was of the same status. Its radiating oppressive spirituality felt nearly identical to the one that had stolen his heart, the Saphira Castle, from him a few weeks ago. Loki used one of the members of the Aurora Order he'd parasitized to listen to the doll. The effect was immediate. Its head exploded in a spectacular display of flesh and blood. However, before the explosion could do much in the way of staining anyone around it in gray matter, everything about the explosion slowed down. The fine mist of blood slowed down, the shower of fresh bone fragments and flesh slowed before they stopped altogether and started to reverse. Loki saw the doll's eyes glow an eerie green-white before the marionette regained its pristine head. Everyone looked at the sudden series of events with surprise. But not everyone comprehended it. While most knew that it occurred because of the doll in Grindelwald's hands, few understood how or even why. The saint from Aurora Order immediately stepped over and checked the rose bishop that had just exploded and found him to be completely normal. The lad was even keen on simply kneeling on the floor and whispering praises to the Lord as anyone would do in such a situation. He then turned towards Grindelwald since he didn't understand what had happened, as did Hermione, Ron, Tonks and Belmont. Loki only mumbled in the silence. So, she is here too. A gleam showed in Grindelwald's eyes as he smiled. His fingers twisted one of the doll's eyes to set them right before he spoke again, and she can only be here, where this doll is. You want me to choose? Loki asked softly as he looked at Grindelwald, whose smile only widened. Yes, of course. I'm glad I don't have to spell out the question for you, but choices must be made. Loki looked at Grindelwald. The previous fearsome angel with spirituality as vast as the solar system itself was nowhere to be seen. Instead, in its place was a simple sequence 3 Beander from what Loki could tell. Grindelwald's spirit body threads had been disguised too. They appeared so ordinary that he found it confusing. Who was he pretending for? If he was already a sequence 1 attendant of mysteries, an angel, and had the Fool Pathway blasphemy card, why had he not just revealed himself and turned everyone here into his marionettes? Even if right now Grindelwald was afraid of the goddess of fate he was holding in between his hands, would there have been a reason for him to simply not turn Loki into his marionette the second he had seen him or even walked into his range, which was definitely intercontinental? Loki didn't think so. So the only other option was that Grindelwald had done something to temporarily advance his sequence. Or could only use his sequence 1 abilities temporarily. Why? Loki had no answer to that question, for now, but the gears in his mind were already spinning for possible solutions to this now open puzzle. Loki's gaze was on Grindelwald for only a moment before it landed back on the doll in his hands. Loki could for some reason feel smugness radiating off of the doll even through its domineering effect, as if it were holding an "I told you so" expression, irrespective of if its mouth was sewn into a smile. Through his connection to his marionette earlier, Loki had seen distinctly the doll had used an ability that manipulated its fate to reset its state of corruption and destined death that it had doomed itself to upon listening to the secrets of a great old one. Loki then looked up at Mother Tree of Desire. If he was right, she was waiting for the doll in Grindelwald's hands to make a move. Was the doll powerful enough to undo everything that had happened in the abyss? Loki didn't think so, since it had happened too long ago from now to make any meaningful change to it unless it had been frozen in time in some other way. But the mere fact that the person within the doll was a great old one, someone on the same level if not more than herself, who had lost her Sephiroth, had given her a pause. Loki then looked at Grindelwald once again. He seemed to have some control over the doll in his hands. Loki didn't know how a full-powered Great Old One could be controlled by a mere sequence one angel or a doll for that matter, but he did understand its implications regardless of if his ideas about the Key of Light were wrong. Grindelwald could take away the protection of anyone he wished right now. And that included Nicholas, Perenelle, Hermione, Ron, Belmont and Tonks. Loki looked at them and sighed, but before he could turn back and answer, Perenelle spoke up rather rashly after having recovered her voice somehow, since Loki's theft of it couldn't last long as she was 2 sequences above her and an angel. "I'll pummel you to death if you choose you." Loki didn't let her finish, his hands stretched as he stole all sound coming from around her or anyone in the aforementioned group for that matter. But Loki didn't pay attention to them anymore. Instead he turned to Grindelwald, smiled and continued. "I'm sorry, I don't understand, could you tell me your question?" Grindelwald's eyebrows raised in slight surprise. Buying time. To think of a solution. He nodded, how capable. "But I must let you see how futile it is, since none can come here to help you. And so I will entertain you by being explicit." Loki smiled, his eyes crinkling into crescents as he did, looking very happy. "You must choose between them and yourself," Grindelwald said softly. "If you choose yourself, they'll pay the price; if you choose them, you'll have to bear the burden." His eyes narrowed with a sharp hatred as he said those words, as if he was reminded of something terrible, but he didn't let it show in his actions. His body remained calm and his hands remained on the doll. However, Grindelwald's actions didn't stop there. Hermione suddenly collapsed to the floor. In the short moment he finished speaking, Grindelwald had excluded her from the protection of the doll. Hermione was knocked out cold for simply being in the presence of a Great Old One and getting corrupted before she was saved by bringing her back into the protection of the doll. In truth, this was supposed to be the normal reaction and not how Loki's marionette had reacted so calmly earlier. He only realized this belatedly, since he was so used to dealing with corruption that he'd forgotten its burden on the body. But there was no need to bring up things no one noticed anyway, so Loki looked at Grindelwald and, unlike everyone's expectations of sheer violence and anger, smiled like everything was under control. He then nodded slowly before speaking, "I understand. But why do you think that no one can come here to save me?" Grindelwald laughed. "Here? To save you? Who's brave enough to listen to her sweet whispers for a mere sequence 4 demigod?" Grindelwald said with a crazed smile. Loki smiled again, irrespective of everyone whose voices he'd stolen earlier, looking shocked to learn that Loki was a demigod. "True. Not a lot of people have the ability to help me right now." "So you do understand," Grindelwald said, his smile widening into a Cheshire grin as he nodded softly while extending his hand. Loki looked at Grindelwald's outstretched hand, beckoning him to the other side, and chuckled softly. "You're a pretty weak angel, Grindelwald," Loki said. Grindelwald's outstretched hand froze in place as his face frowned with anger. But Loki didn't stop there. "No," he continued, "if I'm to make a guess, was it because you split your soul? Did he make you split it? In some situation like this? What did you even split it for? I don't think anyone who knew how to split their soul in such a brash way would have. Loved ones, was it the uniqueness in the Department of Mysteries and yourself that you had to choose between?" By the end, Grindelwald's pale face turned red. The veins on his temples throbbed as his outstretched hand balled up into an angry fist. However, Loki didn't stop there. "You tried advancing to the status of a true god while someone else was aiming to be a Great Old One to stop the outer gods from attacking and collapsing the barrier. How selfish." "Enough," Grindelwald shouted with an almost brutally violent anger. "Selfish? How is it selfish for me to grow stronger before someone else when they chose not to advance because it wasn't the best time according to fate?" Grindelwald's heterochromatic eyes asked Loki with a fierce glare. But Loki continued. He shook his head and spoke in an even deeper tone of disappointment. "Those are just the ramblings of a washed-up angel that lost in a completely fair battle he picked on his own." Grindelwald was about to say something, but Loki interrupted and continued as if he'd read the man's mind. "Even if you didn't die and are alive today beyond him, who is dead, isn't that only because you were spared because of the situation of the 4th epoch?" The words left Grindelwald with a small shock as Loki continued. "Weren't you spared because most other gods were dead? And you could fill in the numbers." Grindelwald's face scrunched up with disgust, but Loki continued to drive the nail into Grindelwald's head with a soothing and convincing tone. "Aren't you just a glorified slave that has lost its master? If you lost so thoroughly then, why do you think you'll fare any better this time? The words seemed to have brought some sense back into Grindelwald as he spoke sharply. I have fate in my hands, squeezing the head of the doll he was holding. Loki could feel an aura of anger radiate from the doll at that, but he wasn't sure if he was the only one feeling it since no one else had reacted. Even so, Loki simply smiled as he spoke rather mysteriously. But what are you going to do with that? After all, a doll's just a doll, is it not? How is it going to save you from him? Huh? Grindelwald asked, his senses suddenly tingling as a horrific sense of danger and premonition of horror crept up his spine. Suddenly, all the Aurora Order members in the area pulled out a monocle, conjured out of thin air as they placed it on their eyes. Including the Sequence 3 Saint. No, Grindelwald whispered, horrified. Loki felt the doll looked surprised too, and so he responded with his own, smug. Thank you for reading. The book just finished on Patreon, so thank you for all you support so far. The Patreon supporters have supported me through rough times and I thank them greatly for that. While you readers, who support me with comments every day, also give me a lot of love and motivation to keep writing the book, so thank you. I hope you all keep supporting me like this. Thanks a lot. Look forward to my next books. Suddenly, however, Grindelwald smiled eerily, and before anyone could reflect on why, the world motioned in reverse. It all happened in steps, as if someone had started to undo the turned pages of a flip book. Step by step, in frames, like the world was being transitioned through various save stages. The monocles raised to their eyes went back down. The words that everyone had just spoken were taken back. Loki's theft of sound was undone. The Rose Bishop exploded and reformed once again, and the world reached back to the point it was when everyone had just been brought into the abyss. When the world unpaused in its return, Loki was the first to break out of his trance as he keenly observed himself and then everyone else. He looked at Grindelwald with confusion as the man smiled eerily with a wide grin while Loki remarked mentally, I fully digested my potion. How? Loki's gaze then fell on the doll in Grindelwald's hands that looked eerily familiar, and then at the outer god in the abyss of the sky. Did they realize that I parasited the Aurora Order members? Loki thought with confusion. No, their spirit body threads go back into the Saphira Castle. They shouldn't have been able to glean anything unless they stole those spirit body threads from me in some way, even if they could see those spirit body threads in the first place. Loki cast a suspicious glance at the doll in Grindelwald's hands as a strange thought crept up into his mind. She did have the ability to take control of the Saphira Castle for a few moments. Loki frowned. Is there no simpler explanation than a Great Old One capable of hijacking other Great Old One Sephiroths? Loki's thoughts suddenly froze as they reached this question, since a different strange idea made a space for itself in his mind. Reboot. Were we all rebooted? Loki kept his emotions under control, but his confusion and wariness were difficult to hide as Grindelwald picked up on them rather easily. You figured it out surprisingly fast for being a mere Sequence 4 demigod, Grindelwald noted with furrowed brows. Are you really only a Sequence 4? How do you even know so much anyway? Loki was about to return a snarky reply, but he paused. Was there a point in exchanging dialogues right now? Wouldn't that just empower the enemy with more information about him? What happened? Grindelwald snarled, scared already. He asked with wide arms, the doll floating in between for a second until he picked it back up. Nicholas and Perenelle had still not realized what had happened. They did have backups in case something about time had been messed around within their presence. However, the reboot of the Wheel of Fortune pathway didn't reverse time itself. It simply reset the world into a previous save state by rewriting the current fate of the world in an area. As such, when they heard Grindelwald's words, they found themselves confused and slightly angry, since they thought he was talking about using them as bargaining chips with Loki because of the presence of an outer god. Perenelle's fingers curled up into a fist until her nails dug deep into her skin, drawing blood as she glared at Grindelwald. She'd only belatedly realized that Grindelwald had predicted her trap and then made sure she fell for the larger trap he'd placed to use her trap against everyone she wanted to save. Her eyes fell on Loki then, to try and think of ways to send him back safe so that he could be with his sister. However, she suddenly saw Loki smile. Scared? Loki asked with a soft, pleasant tone, as if his worries had been left behind in Yesterland. He then conjured a monocle in his hand, causing everyone around himself to become surprised. You can feel it, can't you? Loki asked Grindelwald, holding the monocle on his palm and looking at it as it radiated a strong aura of suppression and authority. The monocle in his palm was a product of fusing the mentor deceit characteristics and the error pathway card of blasphemy into a single item. While it wasn't quite a mystical item since it lacked the use of the will within the sequence 3 mentor of deceit characteristics, Loki had made sure to heavily enhance its sense of divinity by deceiving the characteristics itself to believe that it was a part of him, and while leveraging his connection with the Saphira Castle. This gave the item a free sense of suppression from a real Sephiroth. Yet he still added the blasphemy card for good measure to deceive his target. As such, the monocle in his hand appeared to be the reincarnation of a great old one in flesh, or at least an item related directly to them, content, their will within. And at this moment, it felt rather suffocating, even more so than the outer god present above them. Of course, both the goddess of fortune and mother tree of desire saw it exactly for what it was, a cheap imitation. But could such invaluable experience to make comparisons with exist in the mind of a mere sequence 1 angel? Loki didn't think so, and hence he continued to speak. Do you know what happens if I place this on my right eye? Loki asked while raising the monocle pinched between his fingers slowly. Grindelwald's focus remained on Loki. He gulped dryly as his grip over the doll in his hands tightened, much to the displeasure of the one within. Loki, however, continued without pause. The monocle sat on his eyes with a crisp clink. A light gleamed off its rim that blinded Grindelwald and all those present for a second. However, when the light returned, Loki wasn't Loki anymore. Loki emitted a strange aura of suppression as the gray fog rolled off his body. It was wrapped around him like a cloak, but its ends constantly unraveled into a gray mist that started to merge with the surrounding area. Loki's face was slowly shrouded within the fog, hiding everything about his face except the monocle, which was iridescent as a golden ring around where his right eye was. Loki's gaze was no longer on Grindelwald or even on Mother Tree of Desire. Instead, Loki vanished from his spot and reappeared in front of the doll Grindelwald was holding. The act made Grindelwald immediately take a step back, or at least made him try, until he heard Loki's soothing voice, "I won't harm you," which genuinely caused him to believe that Loki was there to coddle him. Loki deceived Grindelwald and stole any of his thoughts of rebellion or using the doll to reboot the world. Instead, Loki quietly and deceptively inserted thoughts of sitting back and watching as Loki made his last struggles to free himself and those around him from Grindelwald's clever trap that had worked. Loki gently peered at the doll that Grindelwald so eagerly showed off to him and stared at its face. His eyes looked at it for a while before they crinkled into an almost imperceptible frown before landing on an Aurora Order demigod he'd fought recently. Loki looked at the doll once again and then smiled in an appreciative manner, although he didn't know if the doll could see him doing so through the veil of the gray fog. He then, much to the displeasure of the one within the doll, left it in Grindelwald's hands, who smiled happily at seeing his enemy acknowledge the undeniable strength of his precious weapon of mass destruction, and relaxed. Loki then turned to Nicholas, Perenelle and the others. His gaze lingered on Nicholas for a few seconds, until it fell onto Hermione. "You've done well to call me Miss Magician," Loki said calmly, causing Hermione to feel flushed. This was what Belmont had told her earlier. Or rather, the message he delivered to her directly from the true goddess of the apothecary pathway. She was to continuously recite an honorific name in her mind after receiving the message. The one who holds bonds beyond time. The being that can grant rebirth. The embodiment of protection. And while Hermione didn't know why a different true god would tell her to do that, since according to Nicholas the honorific name didn't seem to be related to the true goddess of the apothecary pathway, Hermione did so nonetheless. She continued thinking and repeating it in her mind even when they were brought into the abyss. And just as she was worried that no one was coming to help them in the abyss, and when she had started thinking of ways to waste the time so that whoever was to save them would arrive in time, Mr. Error descended. It left Hermione surprised. A new honorific name. Just how many does he have? Hermione wondered, but then accepted the fact, since someone who had lived seemingly as long as Mr. Error had, was bound to have at least a few mysteries. Loki, however, knew none of this, at least until he happened to directly see Hermione's body of heart and mind, since his current form was rather unstable, a hopscotch of advancing in sequence through a loophole, being forcefully stabilized by the authority of a Sephiroth, which kept the will in the Beander characteristics from corroding his sanity. Time was running out, and hence, Loki spoke quickly. Your current contributions are enough for your wish. Loki said softly. Hermione's eyes widened as Loki opened his palm and handed over to Hermione a white blob of warmth. Not knowing how to handle the white blob, Hermione fumbled before Nicholas calmly used his wand to guide the soul into a thin glass container which he handed over to Hermione. Loki then turned to Perenelle. Thank you for taking care of my vessel, your efforts. Vessel. Hermione suddenly blurted, her voice clearly carrying surprise but an even greater amount of worry. She'd expected Mr. Error to be angry, yet Loki kept calm. He looked at Hermione and spoke softly, it's complicated. Sensing his time running out quicker than expected, Loki only nodded at Perenelle who was already in tears, before turning to look at Grindelwald. Loki snapped his fingers making a sound that only Grindelwald heard, causing him to snap out of the trance he was in as he looked at everyone, bewildered. Loki however walked up to him and spoke with a click of his tongue. Tisk. You're just as weak as you were back then, you foul creature. Grindelwald's face turned red in anger, but before he could speak, Loki continued. Either way, you've presented me with a fantastic opportunity. Grindelwald's eyes widened, but Loki continued regardless of his surprise in a sarcastic tone. Just like the last time, what's it with you and providing me methods to grow stronger? Is that why fate let me keep you alive back then? Grindelwald's eyes widened further in surprise as he looked at the doll in his hands. He then looked back up at Loki in fear, his eyes jumping around the billowing gray fog obscuring Loki's features before locking in on the golden monocle, causing Loki to chuckle. Don't worry. I still can't kill you it seems, for whatever reason, but I'll be back pretty soon for the bounty anyway. I just hope you're alive until then. Loki's tone turned eerie by the end. And instead of waiting around any longer for Grindelwald to speak up, Loki simply walked to the Aurora Order Saint. Loki snapped his fingers and caused the Aurora Order Saint to raise his hands. Along with it rose a large gate made up of shadows. Loki walked up to it, knocked on it lightly and then pushed it open to walk in. He sent a last glance everyone's way before walking into the void that seemed darker than the abyss. With Loki about to vanish into the abyss, Grindelwald came to his senses rather quickly and used the doll in his hands once again. The world attempted to reboot this time, however it fell flat. Instead of the world turning around and returning to a previous save state, the gray fog thrummed with a powerful sense of suppression as all the spirit-body threads in the area avoided having their fate be rewritten. Grindelwald stared wide-eyed, and confused. He couldn't believe it. The world had betrayed him once again, just as it had done a few centuries prior. Single quote. His vision was colored with rage as Grindelwald's only means of expression now was revenge. Before Perenelle or Nicholas could even predict what Grindelwald was about to do, he looked at all the Aurora Order members who were simply looking at him blankly and rebooted his own fate, leaving them to die a corrupted death. Except, Grindelwald's feet stayed planted at the same spot he'd been standing at. Wah! Before Grindelwald knew it, he felt it. The heavy explosive gaze of the Great Old One that had been hanging out just above, and rightfully so, if the doll could be stopped by just the lingering energy of a Sephiroth, a true Great Old One like her was more than enough to take it on and suppress it without succumbing to any traps. Loki looked at the dark and dreary world around him. Each time he looked someplace else, he felt something shift at the edges of his physical sight. In spite of his well-defined night vision that made the dark as clear as day, it felt like the sourcelessly cast shadows were on a constant drift, moving slowly like the rustling of grass under the wind, only much more soundless while exuding a sense of deathly intent. His goal, for entering the shadow world, a domain of a true god, was clear to him. He hadn't realized it immediately, but his worms of time stowed away in the Saphira Castle had survived the imminent reboot inside the abyss. And so he'd regained his memories midway through after being forcefully fed them by his worms of time. While it gave him some much-needed perspective about their current situation, he'd gained a rather important key from the previous reboot. In the previous reboot, when the Sequence 3 Templar had stepped in to check on the Aurora Order member who'd just exploded, Loki had used the Mentor of Deceit characteristics to immediately deceive and parasitize the man with full force, since he didn't have anything else to worry about and having a surprise thorn in a battle would only benefit him. Except along with a Sequence 3 Saint, who fought valiantly for a few petty seconds until he saw the true creator's image telling him to surrender, Loki gained a new piece of information he couldn't make heads or tails out of. They wanted to sacrifice me to the true creator. Not kill me. Or have one of them graze me. Loki asked himself as he quickly went through the memories of the saint for any other clues. He looked at the dark terrain around himself and tried matching it with the images inside the memories he'd just sneaked a peek into. But to no avail. While he could see plenty clearly in this darkness, the world didn't have any defining features. Loki guessed that the members of the Hanged Man pathway had a special sense or affinity that allowed them to travel through this darkness without any visual anchors. And so he wondered with a frown. Why hasn't he come to me yet? If they wanted to sacrifice me, the gray fog. Loki quickly undid his get-up that he'd used to scare Grindelwald, and the effect was immediate. Even before the last of the gray fog wrapping around Loki vanished, the world shifted. A heavy sense of rot and decay filled the air. Loki could feel himself losing his mind at a rapid pace. The world started to seem filled with degenerate possibilities, and Loki felt like he had to compulsively act on them if he wanted to maintain the ephemeral joy that seemed to be sprouting within him at the thought of doing so. Powerful. Loki mumbled under his breath, trying to think straight as he once again searched around the area, wondering if all this was just the effect of the shadow world or if the Hanged Man was somewhere around. And when he didn't find One-Eyed Jesus, Loki sighed before closing his eyes, taking a deep breath and whispering, "Not so omniscient now, are you?" Loki expected something explosive to happen once he said those words and kept his guard up. But nothing did. It was as if the true creator had suddenly turned deaf ears. Or he suddenly became busy with something. Loki thought to himself. Just then Loki felt the shadows rustle behind him. His extended all-round vision spotted them morphing into a single humanoid figure as it landed on its feet rather lightly. The figure twitched for a few seconds, its limbs twisting arbitrarily before they set into place as they began to move more freely. Even still, each step that the figure took towards Loki looked like a struggle, with sickening sounds of tearing flesh resounding in the mostly silent area as it did. Its feet merged with the shadows each time it stomped the ground, as if trying to gain more support and walk without falling in this new form it had been given, before harshly tearing the strong bond to the shadowed ground as it ripped them apart to take the next step. The creature stumbled down until it reached Loki before it simply stared at him while filling the area with an unmistakable smell of death and rot. Loki nearly gagged as he turned around and looked at the shadow creature. It felt like the work of an amateur. Even worse than the newly advanced Rose Bishop with access to flesh and blood servants. Did making so many of his believers into marionettes at once turn him more wonderful? Loki thought to himself. He had originally planned to instruct Walburga to kill more of the Aurora Order members at the right moment to madden the true creator if he interfered directly in their fights, but things had spiraled out of control too fast for him to be able to do so. And so all he'd done was turn a lot of his believers he'd sent into marionettes. It caused Loki to feel puzzled. He looked around the shadow creature before looking back at it once again and speaking out loud. "You wanted to see me. I mean, I know I'm pretty good looking, but you're not into me, are you?" "I'm sorry, I don't." Loki didn't get the chance to finish his sentence. A sharp, large, single eyeball opened up on the center of the shadow creature's face as it stared down Loki while emitting an immense pressure and aura filled with degenerate madness. Loki almost immediately activated his get-out-of-jail-free card to be teleported into the Saphira castle with the help of a worm of time, but he stopped. The shadow creature's clawed hand gripped Loki's wrist firmly, setting him in place, binding him in a sort of seal that pinned his body in place. Loki could easily break the seal given how poorly it was constructed, but he didn't since the creature had already closed its eyes, making him confused once again since it had stopped harming him. Just what's going on? The shadow creature kept its no-eye gaze held on Loki in a silent pause as Loki felt something scan him thoroughly. However, this surprised and shocked him terribly. The scan wasn't from the outside, or even a gaze that penetrated Loki's defenses forcibly. No, the gaze emerged from within the sea of subconscious itself. As if someone had flooded Loki's mind from within. His defenses were bypassed, his heavily warded runic arrangements wholly untriggered, and Salazar's rune of concealment completely ignored. A chill ran up Loki's spine. And although the shadow creature didn't have eyes or even a mouth, Loki felt like it was wearing an inhumanely wide grin. "Oh, how?" Loki mumbled. But the gaze passed away without doing anything. It didn't plant a seed in his body like it had done with Klein, and neither did it linger. It only scanned Loki's memories on the surface, not even touching his secrets before leaving as silently as it had arrived. The wrinkles in Loki's brain wriggled like worms trying to escape becoming prey as they tried to make heads or tails of the situation. From within, through the sea of subconscious. Omniscient. But that's Adam's domain. Is he also from the visionary pathway? And Dumbledore is just his virtual persona. No, that can't have been the case, or the founders would have made a mention of it somewhere. But then, thinking about Rowena's unfounded betrayal that was at the back of his mind, he questioned his conclusions. Would they have? However, Loki quickly shook away such thoughts. He'd already seen how dedicated Salazar was, even if Rowena had tried to sell him out, which hadn't even been confirmed. Either way, Salazar would have immediately warned him about Dumbledore had that been the case. But he hadn't. So Dumbledore wasn't a virtual persona, at least not the true creator's virtual persona anyway. That still left the question, how then did he bypass all those defenses and emerge from within my sea of subconscious? Loki's mind thought, but for a moment before it spat out an answer that he couldn't, or rather didn't have the courage to believe because of its immediate implications. The Chaos Sea. Loki looked at the shadow creature in front of him and gulped audibly. He thought of the chilling touch of the shadow creature around his wrist, like the lunette of a guillotine around a condemned's neck. As if waiting for this moment, the degenerate thoughts came back in full swing. Shadows of his actions or inactions in the past returned to haunt him. His indirect choice to leave the 3 students who'd been ensnared by the primordial demoness to be taken by her became amplified enough to force guilt down his throat, forming a tight knot in his chest that made his breath light, shallow and rapid. His experiments on various people in the darker parts of Nocturne Alley to fulfill the Disc of Wishes, or even simply learn more about magic, made him feel disgusted with himself. Is this how Elaine will feel when she learns about the real me? Loki almost felt compelled to carve himself up and offer bits and pieces of his flesh to the great being in front of him to cleanse himself of his sins and corruption. Putting a forceful pin on such thoughts, Loki tried to calm the raging storm of degenerate thoughts that had washed ashore in his mind through the sea of subconscious. And while a part of his mind did so, another part focused on decrypting the secrets of the situation at hand. He hasn't killed me yet. Or rather, he hasn't killed anyone using the Chaos Sea yet, or the Aurora Order members would have been much more sneaky with their ritualistic sacrificial assassinations. The true creator wouldn't even have been termed a mad god if he had access to the Chaos Sea. While the true god of the Hanged Man pathway did have a deep connection to the Chaos Sea, which gave them the ability to use it to corrupt all things regardless of their nature, Loki didn't think the true creator had anything more than that, like a direct access to the Chaos Sea. And if he truly had access to it while he was mad, the world wouldn't have been such a normal place to live. That leaves 2 options. Either he's been pretending to be mad all along and has been waiting to reveal his access to Chaos Sea for some grand reason, or he truly is mad and has extremely limited access to it. While the former sounded grand and described the true creator as the true dark horse of the era, Loki found it rather unbelievable. Would a sane person truly live with people as crazy as those from the Aurora Order for so long? Maybe they could even use the Chaos Sea to cleanse themselves of the corruption induced by the nature of their crazy and fanatical believers, but would they subject themselves to such self-inflicted torture for so long for no apparent reason? Loki didn't think so, since the true creator would have nothing he could want if he had the Chaos Sea, since that would single-handedly give him the ability to take over every other pathway in the God Almighty group. What would such a strong being want with a mere sequence 4 demigod? Had Loki offended him in some way, like Grindelwald? But if that was true, why hadn't he been killed yet? Why did he wish to meet Loki instead? Which meant that there had to be some other reason that the true creator had access to the Chaos Sea even in his maddened state. A reason which made it so that he could use the Chaos Sea temporarily for little tricks, but do nothing of significance with it. A reason that had chained him to it without letting him use any of it. Like bringing a parched man to the only pond in a desert, only to lock him inside a glass box. Single quote. Chaos Sea, source of modern magic. The domain of degenerate. How's all this connected? For more thrilling fanfiction stories like this, check out my channel Fanfic Audiobook. Dive into epic adventures, mysterious realms, and legendary journeys brought to life through immersive storytelling. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more amazing audiobooks.